On a cold winter night, snow drifted like cotton wool, covering the space with pure white but also lingering with so much sadness. A few storms suddenly blew in, howling in waves outside the simple wooden house, emitting a gentle, warm firelight. Inside that light-filled house, the sharp sound of a glass falling to the ground suddenly rang out, breaking the quiet and cozy space. Under the flickering firelight, a skinny young man with auburn hair was kneeling on the ground. He covered his mouth in horror, trying to stop the flow of blood. At this moment, another man's voice echoed throughout the room. This poison has the effect of neutralizing the power in your veins. Although for you, it only has a temporary effect, a few minutes at most, the man who is calmly saying those words is quite young, and he is also wearing the king's outfit. The blonde brown-haired guy was kneeling at the feet of the noble young king, silently listening to every harsh word of the man who had just poisoned him. The young king continued to give orders, so I mixed in some other poisons. The long-haired guy heartbrokenly asked the king, but why? The young king suddenly said, "You should have known the answer already, it's because of your strength." The long-haired boy was both heartbroken and terrified as he looked at the king he had faithfully served for so many years. But the young king criticized him without mercy, saying that letter of power had no effect whatsoever to help the future of the kingdom. Like so many other rulers in the world, this young king's conscience was consumed by suspicion. If it were a time of war, perhaps things would be different, but now, you are nothing more than a seed that can betray me at any time. The king looked into the other guy's eyes and suspiciously repeated, "I will never betray, I will live the rest of my life in my homeland." "Those are the words you told me, right?" The long-haired guy looked up in shock at the noble king. He never expected that this king would not trust him so much. He looked down at his bloody hands, his heart ached like hell. "I just wanted to clean these bloody hands, even if just a little." He worriedly thought to himself, "I just want to live the rest of my life to repent to those who died because of my magic, and to those who lost the people they loved most because of me. That's it." The fire in the furnace was still burning brightly, just as the king's suspicion was boiling up every second. The king continued to say, "But Ian, do you know? I was very afraid of you, it's finally revealed, behind the shell of doubt, at the end is fear. It's because of Ian's strength. Will surpass his ability to control, so this young king always lives in doubt." The young king honestly admitted, "I almost went crazy from fear of my old friend. An 8th-level magician, someone who could overthrow both me and my kingdom at any time." The king was so scared that he became hysterical and did not hesitate to say words like a knife stabbing straight into Ian's heart, "How can I let such a monster survive?" But the young king did not deny his guilt. He frowned and looked down at Ian, a little guilty, and said, "My old friend, please never forgive me." After finishing speaking, he immediately raised his face and looked forward, returning to the appearance of a king standing above 10,000 people. After saying what needed to be said, the king did not hesitate, coldly turned around and left. A little bit of the previous feeling of guilt was completely gone. The door opened just enough to let the bitter winter winds rush in for a moment, then very quickly it quietly closed, as if marking the silent end of a magician's life. 8 levels. The fire erupted and engulfed the house, the fire of doubt. And the fire of hatred is burning. Ian sat silently in pain amidst the sea of fire. He could not believe that he had been betrayed by his friend, his brother, and also the king to whom he was always loyal. In the end, Ian couldn't hold back the anger in his heart and silently cursed the king, "You bastard." Well, the first person blames the future blames the future. Ian immediately blamed himself, "I was too careless." Then he suddenly touched something hidden behind his shirt. Ian pulled out a dagger and thought, "Ragnar, you are equally careless." His eyes have completely changed, before they were scared and sad, now filled with anger. Ian held the dagger tightly in his hand, thinking to himself, "I've been researching it madly in regret for the life I've lived until now." The dagger was enchanted with a time spell. He frowned and raised the knife, the tip pointed straight at his chest. "If I stabbed it into my heart before the poison took over, would be able to use magic one last time. Either way, he will die. If he doesn't kill himself with this dagger, he won't be able to escape the sea of fire surrounding him on all sides, so why not just use the life of this person who is destined to die?" To test what he himself had been working on all this time. Those were the reasons why Ian without hesitation picked up the knife with both hands and was ready to stab his heart. Ian thought to himself, this would be the only chance to carry out the exorcism he wanted. Then, a stream of hot blood spurted out amidst the sea of fire. As soon as the knife was inserted into his heart, Ian was in so much pain that he vomited blood. Luckily the dagger actually worked its magic. A magical blue light began to spread. Ian used some of his remaining breath to cast the spell, returning everything to its place. He tried his best to cast the last spell of this life, and immediately the magical light from his magic circle enveloped Ian's body. The light of magic gradually swallowed his image, everything became blurry before his eyes. Whether it was success or failure, he could only bet on this knife strike. In a blur, a series of memories flashed through Ian's mind. This was when he came to his mother's grave. Say goodbye to her before becoming the next emperor's companion. Then the memory of the first day he met Ragnar, along with all the trust and loyalty, was also rewinded in the last seconds of his life. At that time, Ragnar was very different to him than it is now, or at that time doubt and fear had not yet arisen in his heart. After that, the days of only killing and killing began. The scene of increasing poverty covered a nostalgic sky. Ian at that time was extremely strong, but also extremely lonely. He had taken the lives of countless people, as a high-level magician serving the king. But in the end, Ian fell into confusion, not understanding the meaning of this slaughter of living beings, and he gradually felt tired of the tragic scenes before his eyes. When the rewinding footage of his life ended, Ian woke up in the form of a boy. Did he just have a nightmare, or was Ian really reincarnated? The boy woke up but his body was still shaking. Ian panicked and asked himself, what just happened? Ian touched his chest and abdomen to check. He did not find any stab wounds from the knife, nor did he feel any pain. He thought worriedly, something unusual must have happened. Suddenly, from behind him, a familiar gentle voice rang out, Ian. He heard the call and immediately turned around. In front of Ian's eyes was his long-lost mother. She kindly asked Ian, what's wrong, did something happen? Ian's eyes widened in surprise, he couldn't speak. Mom, he thought to himself, why is my late mother here? Ian just stood there looking at his mother and wondered, have I succeeded? His hand held his mother's hand, cautiously feeling the warmth that he had no longer felt for a long time. Ian still did not believe that he had been reincarnated. He thought incredulously, maybe, I am meeting my mother in hell. Ian held his mother's hand and turned to look at the scene in the distance, quietly observing to determine whether he was in earth or hell. Not far from where he stood was a familiar small village, where he spent many years as a child. Ian meticulously observed the innocent and lively children waiting in line to be tested. Then nearby there are area knights keeping order for everyone, and the white flag fluttering on top of the tower. Ian looked down at his small hands, he could finally be sure, he was back 30 years ago. Now let's talk a little bit about the test that the kids are excited to participate in, which is the magic reflex test. In order to train outstanding magicians, the foundation of the kingdom's power, the test is for every child in the Green River Kingdom, regardless of status or family background. They are required to take a magic reflex test the year they turn 12. The first part is the magic brain test, which plays the role of revealing magic. The second part is examining the magical heart, the place where magical energy originates, circulates, and stores. Children who meet the requirements of these two tests will immediately be sent to the Magic Academy and can gain national power after graduation. Ian glanced at everything around him, feeling a bit confused. After 30 years, I've come back further than I thought. Ian began to reflect on the magic he used to reincarnate. The dragon language was considered the foundation of magic. The time spell, which I spent a lot of time learning to exorcise my sins, took effect right before I died. Initially, I only intended to return to avoid my sins. But now Ian is back further than he originally expected. But that means he has a chance to change more things. Ian silently remembered his life in his previous life. Many people had to give up everything for me, and many people also had to die because of blind loyalty. Ian bitterly recalled, he, a person who had worshipped the promise of loyalty and friendship to Ragnar, spent his whole life faithfully accepting being used, only to be killed. Thinking about being betrayed, Ian silently made up his mind to not let things end like that again. In this life, everything will be different. At this moment, from the tent of the ivory tower came the sound of knights calling each child to test their magic reflexes. Next, Ian looked towards the Russian tower and thought to himself, to do that, I have to find that thing first. The power of an 8th level magician, and even higher than that, thought so the boy immediately smiled and greeted his mother and ran to the ivory tower. I will come back later. Ian went to a knight guarding the tent and said, I'm Ian Page, from Mogrian village. The knight thought for a while, Mogrian? After a few seconds of thinking, he smirked and said, ah, he's Vanessa's son, right? Come in, don't ask questions, otherwise you'll cause trouble. It's troublesome for you, the magician. Ian followed the instructions and walked inside. Before entering, he glanced at the other knight with suspicious eyes. It seemed like he was not a good person. Inside the tent right now, the young magician was complaining to the captain of the night squad, Sir Aaron, how many more children are there? Mr. Aaron immediately replied, I think you have to stay here for at least another half a day, the magician. After hearing this, he sighed with a very tired expression. Just at that moment, Ian politely looked in and said, I'm sorry. The magician immediately smiled businessily and said hello to the boy, come closer. The magician gently said to Ian, lower your head first, I will use magic to stimulate your brain, you may feel a little dizzy. It's only temporary, so don't worry. As he spoke, the magician placed his hand on Ian's head. After a few seconds of checking, the magician smiled and said, very good. Then he told Ian, now turn your back. When Ian heard that, he didn't understand why his heart jumped and he hesitated to follow. The magician immediately urged him, hurry up, I just felt the magical energy in your brain, which means you will be able to turn your life around. He further explained to Ian, if there is a magic mind in your chest. Ian still stood still thinking, just joining the academy was not enough. He suddenly told the magician, Mister, there is something I want to show you. The magician asked curiously, what is that? Ian was silent again and took a deep breath. After that, a fireball appeared in Ian's left hand. He thought to himself, maybe I should show off a little more. The magician saw Ian's magic ability revealed so clearly and his eyes widened in surprise. A ball of fire? But Ian continued to bring him another surprise, water droplets floating in the air. Ian was currently performing 2 opposing types of magic on both hands. When the magician saw that, he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise in his heart. Double magic. After taking back that magic, Ian pretended to be innocent and asked, I don't know why, but suddenly I can do these things. When the captain and the members of the night squad present heard that, they immediately looked at Ian in surprise. The young magician could not hide his excitement. What? He asked Ian suspiciously, has anyone ever taught you? Ian immediately shook his head and replied, no, no one yet. The magician immediately looked at Ian with suspicious eyes, carefully using magic while asking the boy again, is this really true? As soon as Ian looked, he immediately realized that the magic he was using was the magic of deception, a skill used to detect lies by examining every single movement of the body. The magician started to put pressure on Ian, think carefully before answering me, if you lie, you will probably become a criminal. He carefully emphasized each word warning you and your entire family, even close neighbors will be beheaded. Ian still kept a calm face and replied, how dare you lie in a place like this? The magician immediately smiled shyly at Ian's answer. Hey, my God, he thought to himself, he was so thorough that he couldn't detect any lies. So this boy. Suddenly from outside the tent came a woman's scream, the familiar voice immediately made Ian reflexively turn around to look. He was worried and immediately ran outside to see what was going on. Mother, the scene before his eyes left Ian stunned. His mother was being dragged by a rough hand, she was scared and begged, don't do that. It was the knight with the fake smile from before. He held Ian's mother's hand tightly and raised his voice to command order. Don't you know how many important people are in there? The volume knight did not hesitate to pour out despicable words to Ian's mother right in the middle of a crowded place. Being a widow for 7 years like that, it must be very lonely. You can't sell it anymore at this age, so stop trying to fix the price. It's nice to have someone notice, but they don't even know how to thank you. Ian's mother stepped back in fear, trying to get her hands out of the other man's vulgar hands. You are. The captain of the night squad and the magician who heard the loud noise also went out to investigate. Mr. Aaron immediately asked in a serious voice, "What's going on?" The infamous knight spread his gold and covered it up. "No, it's nothing. This lowly kitchen assistant doesn't know her place, so I'm educating her." Ian heard him insult his mother and immediately became angry. How vile. He thought indignantly, that bastard. Suddenly the magician's hand patted Ian's shoulder to calm him down. He stepped forward and said, "A few minutes ago, this boy was recognized as a magician because he met 2 requirements. That's why this boy and his parents all have power on par with the nobility." The magician looked at the shameless knight, who disrespected nobles and magicians, as if challenging the emperor's authority. This crime can absolutely be judged and given the death penalty. The high-ranking knights following the magician immediately readied themselves to draw their swords. They were just waiting for orders to immediately execute that disrespectful guy. The vile knight immediately turned pale in fear and cried out. "Ah!" He immediately knelt down in front of Ian and frantically begged. Please forgive me. Please have mercy. Please forgive me this time." Ian frowned and asked him. "Why are you apologizing to me? There's someone who deserves your apology more." As soon as the other knight heard that, he exclaimed in surprise. He immediately crawled to Ian's mother's feet and begged, "Lady, ma'am. My crime deserves death. But please give me one more chance." Ian's mother was inherently gentle and weak, so she could only glance at her son. She hesitated, waiting for the boy's decision. Ian. Seeing that his mother didn't seem to have the heart to punish that guy, Ian could only sigh. Draw. Having finished, he walked towards where that infamous knight was kneeling. Ian sat down, leaned close to him and spoke sharply. "Listen here. You disgusting people who talk bad about my mother. I know it all." He whispered warnings to him. "It's best for trash like you to go tell them about it. The lesson you just learned today for me." Ian looked straight into his eyes. The cold look in his eyes made the knight angry and scared. He looked visibly uneasy. Hastily replied. Yes. I understand. Many thanks. Magician. Okay." Ian turned back to the young magician and spoke politely. "Thank you for helping me." He smiled gently and told Ian. The ivory tower's job is to protect the magicians. After that, the young magician turned to the captain of the night squad, Lord Aaron. "From now on, please watch over and protect this child and his mother. I will give you the remaining information through the crystal ball." Mr. Aaron immediately turned to Ian. "Let me take you to the inn where our knights are staying. Is that okay?" Ian held his mother's hand, smiled, comforted her, and told Mr. Aaron. "Yes. We thank you very much." He politely bowed to the magician again before leaving. "Mr. Magician, we ask your permission." As he turned away, Ian's mother whispered to the boy. "Ian, what's going on? Are you a magician?" Ian immediately explained. "Yes, they said so." The magician looked at the boy's back and thought to himself. Even at that age, he was already so smart and had such outstanding talent. Looks like the royal palace and ivory tower are about to be very bustling. That night, quiet darkness fell throughout the peaceful village where Ian lived. The infamous knight from the morning was now drunk. He scowled and spit haphazardly on the way home. Thinking about what happened in the morning, he was still bitterly cursing the turtle. That stupid guy, why the hell would he arrest your father? Damn, you miserable kitchen assistant. As he staggered away, he smiled wickedly. Continue saying dirty words. Sooner or later, in front of him, that woman will, Look at the scene where you have to kneel down and beg. At that time, I will probably be crazy happy. He gloated, imagining humiliating Ian's mother in front of others, without knowing that behind him there was someone silently watching his every move. Ian wore a hooded cloak, and quietly approached the shameless knight. He recited the spell softly, paralyzed. Immediately that guy's whole body stiffened. He was horrified to find himself suddenly unable to move anymore. Seeing that bastard was completely helpless. Ian stood behind him and spoke sarcastically. If you want to move, I'm afraid it will be difficult. But this method is inherently effective. Ian asked him harshly. What did you just say about my mother? The drunk knight was so scared that he even sobered up. He glanced back in shock. Ian told him coldly. I told you I'd keep an eye on you, right? The frightened knight tried to turn his head. He wanted to say something but it seemed like his mouth had become stiff so he could only make moans. Ian calmly told him the story. Today he was humiliated by the son of a lowly kitchen assistant. Because he was so humiliated, he went drinking. Wandering in the middle of a deserted street, he suddenly slipped on this bridge and fell into the fast-flowing water below. And he died like that. As soon as he finished speaking, that scoundrel was immediately thrown into the river. After creating a fake accident to send that shameless guy to hell, Ian revealed a sad look in his eyes and said, "This has made me wonder, is it okay to do this?" He thoughtfully looked at the rushing stream under the bridge and talked to himself. I have come this far just to learn how to atone for the sins of my past life, turn back time so I can make the right choice and get rid of all the blood stains on my hands. But then I realized that I cannot completely erase them. Ian's sad blue eyes looked into the distance. He sadly said, I just want to protect my loved ones. Then suddenly Ian's eyes changed, cold and lifeless, and I would do anything for that. Even though I wished I wouldn't let my hands bleed again, I still hate you, I will never forgive you. At this time, in the river, the knight's body was floating on the water's surface. Ian coldly spoke to that corpse and to the person who poisoned me. For a moment, Ian felt that the knight needed to die, because if he continued to let him live, he didn't know if he would harm his mother in the future. Then he pondered and thought, what caused Ragnar to say those words? Looks like I'm about to understand. After that, Ian quietly left the bridge and returned to his familiar, simple house. As soon as he entered the house, Ian tiredly leaned against the door, sighing lazily, feeling like his head was about to explode. Ian looked at the current weak little body and worried. I never thought I would run out of magic after just one paralysis spell like this. Hopefully this body will develop further soon. Ian looked towards his small bed. He silently stood there watching his mother's peaceful appearance while sleeping. It still seemed impossible to believe that she was actually present next to him now and it wasn't all just a dream. Ian silently called his mother in his heart. The more he looked, the more sad he felt. Then Ian began to recall things that happened in his previous life. He slowly walked towards his mother while thinking about his past life. After a year of entering the Magic Academy, I was brilliantly placed in the first-class magician class. My mother, the person who was left behind in this Mogrian land, died of an illness before seeing his son become a true magician, and live in wealth and happiness. Ian quietly told her, Mom, in this life I promise to protect you. In the dream, Ian's mother seemed to hear her son's whisper. She suddenly smiled. Ian felt even more determined, I will make my mother happy. He looked at his mother worriedly and said softly, so please, live long. Ian silently thought in his heart, in his previous life, he couldn't even protect his friends and abandoned his family. I couldn't protect anything or anyone. But this life will definitely be different. The next morning, at the royal palace located in the capital of the Green River Kingdom, Green Riverdium. Today was still a normal day at Green Riverdium with official matters being handled by the king in his palace office. The emperor of the Green River Kingdom at that time, Terry Green River, who was also Ragnar's father, was discussing something with the owner of the ivory tower. Looking at the newspaper in his hand, the emperor thoughtfully asked, Master, what do you think? Fifth-level magician and owner of the ivory tower, Herbert Leon hesitantly replied, I can't rule out anything right now. However, the emperor raised his eyes to look at him. Herbert quickly explained that magical energy is a part of the soul circulating in the blood. The moment you can move that soul yourself, you are a magician. Stimulating the magical brain through tricks is the simplest method of magical manifestation. Normally, the Academy would teach these methods like how I and other magicians did, but there were also people who claimed it was all their own revelation, and those people, they could freely use it. First-class magic like a great magician. A long time ago, thanks to the presence of the great magician, humanity was able to discover the adaptability of magic. He found a way to manifest magic on his own without anyone teaching him. It is a legend among magicians. The emperor asked suspiciously, "Great magician? Like the presence of dragons in legends or myths?" Herbert immediately replied that the dragon was merely an illusion, but the existence of the great magician was true, because someone had to start it for us to have what we have today. Herbert told the king, "Even my logic cannot explain this case, so I need to verify with my own eyes. The magician sent to Mogrian is not someone who likes to lie." Herbert is worried that if this is just an exaggeration or mistake, then that boy's ability is really dangerous. After explaining in detail, the Tower Master told the Emperor that this is all I can tell you right now. The king immediately crossed his arms over his chest and began to think about what to do now. A moment later, the king called outside, "Prince, are you out there?" The prince stood outside the office door and immediately replied, "Yes, father, it's me." The king then told the prince, "Come in." As soon as he finished speaking, the office door opened. The crown prince of the Green River Kingdom, Hayden Green River, entered with poise. As soon as Hayden saw that the king and the magician Herbert were there, he immediately asked, "Father, call me." The king calmly replied, "Yes, sorry for keeping you waiting." Hayden immediately said, "It's okay, it seems like something happened." The king told Hayden, "The last time you went outside the palace was 5 years ago, when we were on patrol because of the crop failure, right? I think you should go outside for a bit." Hayden was a bit surprised. He meant he wanted me to travel outside the palace. The king replied, "Yes, I will send cavalry and 300 more royal soldiers, along with 3 third-level magicians to accompany you. So, immediately go to Mogrian land and bring back the boy named Ian Phage to me." Hayden still asked in bewilderment. Father said, Ian Phage?" Seeing that Hayden still didn't know anything about Ian, the king looked dissatisfied and told him, "You still haven't heard about that boy? Hey, never mind, I've said over and over again to pay attention to all the kingdom's news. I'll assign another prince to do this." Hayden was afraid that his position would be affected if he assigned this task to another prince, so he also frantically told the king, "Yes, no father, please give this task to me." Facing the king's suspicious eyes, Hayden immediately assured that he would complete the task and make no mistakes. The king finally trusted him with that mission. "Good, now go prepare, it's going to be a long trip to the north." After receiving the order, Hayden immediately left the king's office to prepare to leave. Seeing that the prince had left, and Wizard Herbert also respectfully said to the king, "I would also like to ask permission to retire and prepare." The king asked in surprise, "Do you have anything to prepare?" Herbert explained that you know very well that we magicians hate going outside, and if I don't convince them now, I may not be able to mobilize 3 magicians to accompany me with the prince tomorrow. When the king heard that, he burst out laughing, "Ha ha ha, what he said was right, go." After that, magician Herbert also quickly left the king's office. As soon as he walked out the door, he seemed thoughtful as if he was calculating something very serious. Herbert's close magician, who had been waiting outside, kept asking, "Tower Master, will you return to the ivory tower later?" Herbert immediately said, "No." Then he turned and left and said, "I need to stop a few things first." It seemed like this high-level magician was planning something. His words in front of the king were completely different from now. The scene changes back to the small house of Ian and his mother in Mogrian village. Also that morning, Ian sat in the house looking out the window filled with warm sunlight. He thought to himself, sooner or later, the ivory tower and the royal family would take action. Ian blankly looked outside. He was thinking about his next steps in the future. Ian remembered the determined attitude of the young magician who tested his magical reflexes a few minutes ago. This boy was recognized as a magician because he met 2 requirements. Think until then, Ian thought to himself. Seeing as how he admitted that he was a magician right after the test had just ended, it was very likely that he would have reported it to his superiors right then and there. Exactly what I wanted him to do. Ian seemed satisfied with that, thanks to his memories from his previous life. He grasped the current situation of the kingdom very well. The current king is very eager to find a talented person who can accompany Prince Hayden Greenriver. Meanwhile, the head of the tower, Herbert, is with the 5th Prince Ragnar, so he will need more people in the tower, and this will create conflict between the royal family and the ivory tower. Ian is sure in his heart that whether he is on the side of the king or the ivory tower, or chooses his own path, his potential is limitless. Right now, I am no longer the naive person who allows them to manipulate me. While Ian was calculating his future path, outside his house, the voice of Knight Captain Aaron rang out, "Mr. Magician, please move forward." The young magician who had just met Ian yesterday, was now holding a crystal ball in his hand and came to his door. He cleared his throat a few times, ahem. Then he started shouting loudly for Ian. "Magician Ian Phage of the kingdom, please listen to the king's orders." Ian was also startled by the deafening sound this early in the morning. Ian glanced outside, thinking, the king's order was confirmed. He acted faster than I thought. He slowly opened the door, acting just like a timid country child when he heard the king's words of confirmation. His acting was quite good. As soon as the magician saw him show his face, he immediately said, "Ah, the boy is awake." He excitedly told Ian, "The king has just given an order to you. I will teach you royal etiquette first, please perform the movements as I say." Ian obediently nodded in agreement. The young magician began to guide Ian through the ritual of greeting the royal family, kneeling down on his right knee and placing his left hand in front of his chest. Ian quickly performed the movements perfectly according to the magician's instructions. The magician couldn't help but be surprised when he saw Ian performing the ritual skillfully. What is this? Is this really the first time he did this? After Ian performed the ceremony, from the crystal ball appeared a decree sent from the king. The magician then spoke to Ian, the kingdom's magician, Ian Phage. "Please listen to the king's decree." The young magician immediately read the decree. "I highly appreciate Ian Phage's talent, and recognize you as a magician of this kingdom. I allow your name to be engraved on the ivory tower. I invited you to visit the royal palace and also sent my eldest son to accompany you on the way here. Wishing you a smooth trip." Ian quietly bowed his head and listened to the king's orders. In his heart he was thinking to himself, I can clearly see his intentions. When the magician said, "This is the entirety of the king's decree," Ian slowly stood up. A knight approached and asked the magician, "Can I take him to the Lord's palace now?" The magician happily replied, "Yes." With the magician's consent, the knight immediately walked closer to Ian. He placed his hand on his left chest and introduced, "My name is Arnold, captain of the Mogrian Knights. This Mogrian land has been given the honor of escorting the prince and you. Ian, I will escort you safely to the Duke's palace. We'll leave when you're ready." Not long after that, Ian and his escort arrived at the palace of the Duke of Mogrian Territory. The Lord of Mogrian Territory, Marcus Mogrian, has been waiting for Ian for a long time. As soon as he saw the carriage escorting Ian arrive, he immediately told the palace people, "There he is." The Lord especially carefully advised, "Ravi, Margaret, I will repeat again, pay attention to your own words. At the same time, treat magicians with the utmost respect." Looking at Ian stepping down from the carriage, the Marquis thought to himself, Ian Phage, even though he is young, cannot change the fact that he is the kingdom's magician. And he had enough talent to attract the king's interest. There's nothing wrong with being friendly with him. Thinking so, Huan Tuoc immediately warmly opened his arms to welcome Ian. Hi, the kingdom's magician. Many days later, Ian and his mother stayed at the Duke's palace to wait for the Crown Prince's group to arrive from the capital Green Revertium. And every day Ian practices magic alone, wanting to push his body to quickly develop his magician abilities. At this time, by a window in the palace, two maids were admiringly discussing Ian. The long-haired girl said, "Hey, have you seen that boy at the training ground? Can he turn fire with his bare hands?" The short-haired girl immediately said, "So you think he's suddenly recognized as a magician?" Two old drunk girls talking to each other, what an amazing child. He's been at the training ground for 15 days straight. Maybe he's still there when we're talking. True to their words, Ian was present at the training ground at that time. He went to the training ground alone and took a deep breath to prepare for another session of magic training. Regulating his breathing, Ian slowly raised his hand. He concentrated his thoughts to perform magic and recite the spell, Cold Ice New Tin. Immediately the ground began to freeze. At the same time, large ice spikes appeared all over the training ground. That layer of ice quickly spread to the base of the wall separating the training ground from the palace. Just a few seconds later, the entire training ground was covered with cold air and thick ice peaks crisscrossed each other. Looking at the training ground completely covered in ice, Ian still did not feel satisfied. He sighed and thought, it's still not enough. If it were my previous life, I would not only freeze the training ground, but I could also freeze this Mogrian palace as well. Ian clenched his fists, a little frustrated, thinking to himself, this small body still has too many limitations, I need something that can compensate for the missing magic. Suddenly, the palace butler eagerly called out to him, Magician, Mr. Magician. I saw him looking very rushed and worried. Ian immediately asked him, is something wrong? The butler quickly replied, Magician, please help us. The butler panicked and reported, Mr. Huan Tuoc is missing. Ian asked in surprise, missing? The butler hurriedly told him that he still hadn't returned from the goblin hunting trip yesterday. Young Master Ravi and the knights also went with him on the hunting trip. Currently, we have used up all available human resources to search, but there are still no results. We could only find a few remaining traces of the war. Ian pondered, I don't think now is the time for them to die. He remembered what happened in his previous life. Lord Marcus Mogrian would die at the hands of enemy assassins, right on the threshold of the first unified resistance that would happen in the future. And his son Ravi Mogrian, when the unified resistance begins, he will give up and flee from this land. Because of that, he will be executed after the war ends. Ian thought to himself, if Huan Tuoc and his son went hunting as usual, the possibility of this happening because of his return was very low. After that, Ian was a little worried and asked the butler, don't you think asking Magician Marco for help would be more useful than me? The butler hesitantly said, well, he is currently outside this land on another mission. Ian thought in surprise, the magician of the land had gone outside the designated territory again, was it because of my return? He thought carefully, a magician going outside the designated territory, this is really rare, I don't know the exact details of everything. But this matter must be related to me, for example, if I silently report this matter to the head of the ivory tower, this may cause danger for me. Ian calculated in his heart that the strongest weapon he had right now was the ability to predict the future. He began to worry that if Huan Tuoc's death changed the future, he would lose that weapon. The butler impatiently told Ian, there's nothing more we can do, so I came here to ask for your help. Ian immediately replied, wherever it is, I will cooperate in searching. He told himself, no matter what, I definitely cannot let this happen. Before going with Huan Tuoc's men to search for him, Ian returned to his room to prepare a robe and some personal items. Mom saw him planning to go out and worriedly called, Ian. She said uneasily, I heard about it, are you planning to go up the mountain with the search team? Mom frowned and worriedly asked Ian, was it dangerous? You're too young to do something like this. Seeing his mother so uneasy, Ian immediately smiled and comforted her. It's okay Mom, I'm a magician now. Even so, Ian's mother still said insecurely. But this matter still happened. Ian immediately held his mother's hand and comforted her, don't worry too much, I promise to come back. At that moment, Huan Tuoc's daughter, Lady Margaret, rushed in, sobbing. Yes, I beg you, please find my father and brother. Margaret clasped her hands sincerely and said with tears in her eyes, if you can find them, I am willing to do anything to repay them. I'll ask father to give you money, land, and servants, so, please. Look at her small, trembling hands clasped together. Ian suddenly noticed the small gold ring on Margaret's index finger. He was a little surprised and exclaimed in his heart, that was. Ian immediately assured Margaret that I would find them. Margaret looked at him happily, really, really. Ian suddenly broke up and said, the ring you're wearing, can I borrow it? I feel the magical energy radiating from that ring, it will help me find them. Margaret heard that and immediately took off the ring and gave it to Ian. Okay. Ian did not hesitate to put the ring on his thumb. He immediately felt a clear increase in magical energy. Ian thought to himself, this feeling of abundant energy is exactly like in the previous life. This is the Mogrian ring, a low-level artifact said to increase the magical energy of its wearer. Ian thought to himself, it seems that instead of the heir, the Lord gave it to his daughter. Margaret worriedly told Ian, you must find them, I just lent you the ring, this is a family heirloom that my father gave me. Ian laughed and replied, I already knew that. He thought to himself, this will make up for his missing magic. After getting ready, Ian went to the palace hall to gather with the Mogrian knights. He seriously told them in the manner of a commander, let's go. After that, the knights took Ian to the forest quite far from the Lord's palace. Coming to an area littered with goblin corpses, a knight immediately said, it's here, sir. He showed Ian the long streaks of blood on the ground, we had lost their mark here. Ian turned around and asked, have the dead been buried yet? The knight replied, we haven't found anyone yet, we think they must have been eaten by monsters. On the ground there are indeed many traces showing that there was a terrible chaos, the goblins suffered many casualties. Ian pondered, what remained were only a few dozen goblin kills, they could have been attacked by hundreds of goblins. Ian told himself, I have to find them soon before it's too late. Unable to waste any more time, he immediately used summoning and wolf spirit magic. With the help of the Mogrian ring, Ian's magical energy was indeed much stronger. Surely you will be able to summon a wolf spirit with a large body, brave steps and cold eyes. Ian's magic circle emitted a brilliant blue light, surprising the knights. They asked each other in shock, wolf, did he just say he was a wolf spirit? The successful summoning technique brought a wolf before everyone's eyes. But this wolf is a bit different from what I expected. However, it is certain that it is a wolf, it even cries, ahhu, so prestigious. After just one howl, the wolf changed to barking, making the knights also bewildered. One, little wolf. Ian looked shyly at the wolf cub in front of him, feeling a bit discouraged. If it were my previous life, I would have been able to summon a pretty big wolf. It looked like a puppy. With my current amount of magic, I couldn't do anything more. Putting aside the matter of a big wolf or a small wolf, as long as it is useful, the summoning technique is called useful. Ian immediately pointed to the blood stains on the ground and told the wolf, this smell, do you think you can find the place where they went? The little wolf also listened to Ian very well, he immediately bent down to sniff the blood on the ground. After sniffing it, it immediately ran away, calling and woofing as it ran, as if calling them to follow the stars. The knights were still skeptical and hesitantly said, oh hey, tomorrow the wizard. Ian calmly commanded them, we just need to follow that wolf spirit, the knights obeyed, yes. Meanwhile, on a cliff deep in the forest, the goblins were aggressively rushing to attack the group of lords. Even though Lord Marcus was seriously injured, he still tried his best to fight against the 7 ferocious goblins. He breathed tiredly and looked around, thinking to himself, there are goblins everywhere, what should I do? Looking at those ferocious and bloodthirsty goblins, the Lord could not help but fear that if this continued, everyone would be massacred. The Lord was horrified when he imagined that terrible scene. If he continued to fight in vain like this, everyone would die. Thinking so, he immediately shouted orders to his son, Ravi, we will deal with the goblins here, so you must definitely find a way to return to the palace. The Lord warned his son, told them, Mogrian Mountain was being threatened by goblins, hurry up. Mr. Marcus was only thinking about his son's safety and did not notice that there was a goblin behind him. Tin holds a stick and prepares to rush forward. Ravi looked at his father in panic and cried out, Father, Father. At that moment, the goblin kicked the ground and jumped up. The goblin swung his stick high over his head, jumped up behind the Lord, and was about to hit him on the head. Ravi shouted in terror, Father, there's behind him. Lord Dac turned his head around in shock. In an instant, blood splattered everywhere. Suddenly there was the sound of Ian chanting spells. Frozen Nova. With a puff, the goblin's green blood splashed into the air. The Lord's face was dull, his eyes seemed lifeless. Is Ian already late? Ian walked quietly among the thick layers of ice on the ground. The Lord and the people who were besieged by the goblins earlier were now protected by sturdy ice stakes. They stood there stunned. Ian slowly walked forward, around him was a thick layer of cold air spreading into space. The Lord's eyes widened in surprise when he saw the back of a young boy, his shield moving forward to destroy the goblins like a hero. After Ian finished dealing with the goblins, he turned around to check the situation of the Lord's group. At this point, the Lord vaguely realized that that child was. But he couldn't see clearly anymore, his eyes slowly closed, and the Lord collapsed. The knights rushed forward and shouted, "Lord!" After that, everyone rushed to bring the Lord back to the palace. It wasn't until 2 days later that the Lord was unconscious in bed before he slowly opened his eyes. In his dream, he heard his daughter's cries of joy. "Father, Father, Father!" The Lord looked around the room, it was actually his daughter sitting there. Seeing the Lord wake up, the girl happily called out to him. "Father," the Lord couldn't help but be surprised that he could still see his daughter again. He asked incredulously, "Margaret?" The Lord sat up, rubbed his temples and asked Margaret, "How is it, what happened?" Margaret immediately explained that Mr. Ian saved Father. Margaret cried and said, "Dad, you and I have been unconscious for 2 days, you don't know how worried I was." Hearing that the Lord was awake, the butler immediately rushed over. "My lord, fortunately you are awake." As soon as he saw the butler, the Lord worriedly asked, "Hogar, are everyone else okay?" The butler sadly replied that, because of that, the 12 soldiers and Mr. Roten were unable to return. Hearing that, the Lord fell into deep thought. If it weren't for him, he probably wouldn't have been able to return. The Lord immediately asked the butler, "Where is the magician? I must see him personally." Ian was training alone at the training ground at that time. Butler Hogar followed the Lord's orders to find him. "Mr. Mage, here you are." Ian smiled and asked, "I heard the Lord was awake." The butler happily said, "Yes, it was all thanks to the magician." The butler respectfully told Ian, "I was ordered by the Lord to bring you to the reception room. I think he has something urgent to tell you." Hearing that, Ian was a bit surprised. He didn't know what the Lord wanted to see him for. Maybe it was to thank him for saving his life. Ian went to the reception room as the butler said, and a few minutes later, Lord Marcus and his son Ravi entered. "Oh, you're welcome." Ian smiled and asked him, "How are you feeling?" The Lord happily replied, "Thanks to everyone's concern, I feel much better. I would like to express my sincere gratitude for your help, for ensuring the present and future of the Mogrian family and the foundation of our homeland." While the Lord said thank you to Ian, Ravi standing behind also smiled and nodded at him. The Lord placed his hand on his left chest, expressing sincerely, because he also swept away the goblins of Mogrian Mountain and protected our territory. I cannot be called a great lord of the empire if I let this go without giving you a suitable reward. So after thinking carefully, I chose this. The Lord said, pointing to a small box. Lord said to Ian, "Please open it." Ian curiously opened the lid of the box, not knowing what important thing was inside. As soon as he saw the item in the box, his eyes widened in surprise. This was. Holding the Mogrian ring in his hand, Ian listened in amazement to the Lord's explanation. "I heard the story from Margaret, that you borrowed this ring because you could detect mana from the ring." The Lord curiously asked Ian, "I thought it was just an old heirloom, but what power does that ring have? Did it help you?" Magician. Ian immediately explained, "This ring amplifies the mana of its wearer. It helped a lot when the scene scanned the goblins in the canyon." Hearing that, the Lord happily told Ian, "Luckily, I want to give that ring to you. Master, please consider it as a token." Ian looked at him in surprise, "A token?" The Lord immediately told him that, from now on, Mage Ian Phage would forever be considered an honored guest of the Mogrian family. This will be the token of this lasting promise. Will you accept this token? Ian raised his hand to touch the ring, thinking deeply, forever an honored guest. 1,000-year contract with the Empire's nobility. Without hesitation, he put the ring on his thumb. It's not certain what benefits that contract will bring you in the future, but for now, this ring will compensate you for a significant amount of mana. Master Ian put on the ring as a sign of approval, and the Lord respectfully bowed his head and said, "Our family will always welcome Mr. Ian Phage to visit if he needs help from our family. We promise to always stand by his side." The Lord and his father together placed their hands on their left chests and pledged, "I swear on the northern stream of Lukha, that we will keep this promise from generation to generation." Scene changes to a trail through the woods near the Lord's palace, early the next morning. The leader of the Mogrian Knight squad along with a few entourage were taking Ian somewhere. Ian suddenly turned and asked, Captain, how far is it to Lloyd Town? Captain Arnold immediately smiled and said to Ian, "We will get there soon, just cross the hill over there and you will see it." Ian looked in the direction Arnold pointed, thinking a bit about his conversation with Lord Marcus yesterday. After receiving the ring, Ian said to the Lord, "My Lord, I have something to ask." He asked the Lord, "Do you know any alchemists in your territory who are capable of creating medicinal pills?" The Lord thought for a moment and then said, "In the town of Lloyd in the north there is an alchemist named Redio." The cold-fighting man thought and said, "They came from the capital, but because of a special herb they migrated north." Ian was a bit hesitant. He thought to himself, "Pharmacist Redio is a name he has never heard of in his previous life. I hope I can find a medicinal pill to replenish the amount of mana I've lost, even though I'm worried that Redio's appearance in my life will have certain effects on the future." But right now it was the only way he could think of to restore some of his magical energy. Arnold and Ian walked a little further when they suddenly heard a knight shouting, "Captain, Mr. Wizard, over there, we can see Lloyd Town." What made the knight so panicked was because the whole town of Lloyd was engulfed in flames, thick black smoke rising and covering everywhere. Ian was stunned by this scene. What the hell is wrong with the town? How could there be such a big fire? As for Captain Arnold, he didn't know what danger he saw but immediately picked up his sword and his face looked very excited. Could it be that other goblins are attacking this town? Meanwhile, below the town, scenes of looting and killing are causing terror to the people here. Not only were the houses burned, but even the people of Lloyd Town were bleeding under the swords of the robbers. The guy holding the axe seemed to be the leader of the robbers. He gleefully ordered his subordinates to gather the small group and start reuniting. Finish quickly to get to Coldwood. One of his subordinates immediately grabbed a child in the village, letting the child scream and struggle. The child's father rushed forward shouting, "Douglas." As soon as the father stood up, the robber leader kicked him to the ground. He just poked and kicked him continuously. He was about to die. He was really trash. The father was beaten until he was bloody but the robber still did not stop. Douglas saw his father being brutally beaten and struggled even harder. "Let go, let me go." "Father," the bandit leader turned around and spoke to Douglas. "Ah, that stupid, annoying name." The robber smirked and threatened the boy. "If your father dies, will you keep your mouth shut?" Seeing that the robber had murderous intent, Douglas was frightened and did not dare to scream. He looked at his father with tears in his eyes. The robber threw away the axe and replaced it with a sharp dagger. He raised the knife, approached the man lying on the ground and smiled sinisterly. "I will sell your son to an extremely good place." The bandit leader rolled his eyes and said goodbye. Douglas screamed in horror. No, the boy tried to lean towards his father, but what could a child's strength be able to do against these ferocious robbers? Suddenly, an ice stake pierced the leader's body, blood splattering everywhere. The terrible scene made Douglas silent in shock. The bandit leader died instantly. He fell to the ground immediately. His subordinates cried out in horror, "Girl, what is that? Ice stars, where did that thing come from?" The bandits looked up at the distant hilltop. They panicked, over there, soldiers." Meanwhile, Ian is using his magic ability to create a series of ice stakes floating in the air. Without hesitation, he launched all those sharp ice stakes at the bandits. The robbers ran away in panic, damn it, ran away. 161. However, no matter how fast they move, they cannot avoid death. Silenced screams echoed throughout the valley. After killing the robbers and murderers, Ian stood quietly on the cliff for a long time. He was concentrating on feeling the changes in magical energy in his body. Ian looked at the Mogrian ring in his hand and thought to himself, it worked. Thanks to the ring, my mana limit is probably equal to that of a level 3 mage. At this time, the people of Lloyd Town could feel secure again. The fires have been extinguished, and burned houses can still be rebuilt. But there are still injuries that cannot be healed and lives that cannot be revived. Ian arrived in town, he also felt sad at this tragic scene. As soon as Captain Arnold saw him, he called out, Mage Mage. Ian quickly approached and asked Han, the captain, if any soldiers were injured. Arnold breathed in and said, no, thanks to you we were not injured. Ian breathed a sigh of relief, that's good. He looked around, feeling worried and wondering if he was still alive, the person he was looking for. Suddenly he heard someone shouting Radio's name. Ian immediately turned around and looked intently at the direction the scream came from. A man was holding a barely breathing Radio in his arms, trying to hold on. Douglas next to him was extremely worried and cried out, Father, Father. Ian immediately walked over and placed his hand on Douglas's shoulder, comforting him. I will check it out. As soon as he looked at the man who was breathing heavily, Ian's eyes widened in shock. His skin was pale without a drop of blood, his hair had turned white. Ian was shocked and thought it could be mana poisoning. A disease considered a curse from God. If a certain amount of mana enters the body that carries a mana brain without a mana heart, the mana fragments will not allow the body to stimulate the brain and bring pain. Intensely, for the rest of my life, without a moment of rest. Ian thought to himself, he can't inject mana into himself, so one of the magicians must have done it on purpose. He nervously glanced at Radio. Looking at the evidence, he saw that it was quite bad. Ian told Douglas, wait a minute. Then he placed 2 fingers on Radio. Ian secretly thought that there was a way to suppress the pain for a while, which was to transfer pure mana in and release the remaining mana in the body. Sure enough, just as Ian thought, this method could help Radio relieve the pain immediately. His facial muscles had already begun to relax, and his breathing was no longer as heavy as before. Ian told the man next to him to please take care of his wound. The man flusteredly replied, yes, thank you, thank you. Ian was about to leave when Douglas grabbed his robe. Douglas eagerly asked Ian, my father, will he be okay? Ian hesitantly told Douglas yes. In a moment, Ian understood clearly that the disease could be temporarily treated by transferring mana, but it could not cure this tortoise disease. Douglas continued to ask worriedly. So, will he have a seizure later? Ian was silent, not knowing how to answer Douglas to ease the boy's pain. Ian thought to himself, because the mana he transferred would also become a backlog of mana, that person would have to make a decision to stop continuously transferring mana and endure or die. Thinking for a moment, Ian had no choice but to tell Douglas the truth, that must be it. Douglas burst into tears heartbroken. He whimpered and said, I have to find Landio's flowers and make the antidote. As soon as Douglas finished speaking, he immediately ran away. The man next to Radio immediately shouted, Douglas, where are you going? As soon as he heard the name Douglas, Ian's eyes widened in surprise as he looked at the other boy. The image of an acquaintance from a past life flashed through Ian's mind. I remembered Douglas. That was the name of the greatest apothecary in history at that time, the palace apothecary, Douglas Hammond. A man who was once very poor now stands next to Emperor Ragnar thanks to his genius ability. When I saw him in my previous life, he was always hostile towards the magician. Ian began digging through the information he had about Radio and Douglas, an alchemist who had mana poisoning from a mage, a herb he sought in the north. And what Douglas said earlier, I have to find Lander's flowers and make an antidote. Ian suddenly remembered being poisoned in his previous life, when Ragnar said, it's a poison that neutralizes the mana in your blood. After stringing these things together, Ian and Hong realized a herb had the ability to neutralize mana in the body. If that was real, it must be. Thinking of this, Ian immediately used his hair magic to chase after Douglas. In the blink of an eye, Ian stood in front of Douglas, startling the boy. Ian tries to convince Douglas, there are still bandits outside the village, it is dangerous to enter the forest. Douglas said firmly, but I cannot wait any longer. If I don't find that flower and make the antidote soon, my father will. Ian couldn't think of any other way to stop Douglas, so he used magic to make Douglas fall asleep. Douglas was talking when he suddenly felt his body wobble and then fell down tiredly. His mouth was still mumbling. I have to find the flower. Ian picked up Douglas who had fallen asleep, breathing a sigh of relief because he was able to temporarily stop Douglas from finding the flower that could cause Ian's death in the future. After Douglas fell asleep, Ian took the boy to lie under a nearby tree. Ian observed Douglas and contemplated a solution to the problem related to this boy. Now that I look closely, I can see that if his previous face was not so full of menace, then his current face will look different. Exactly the same as before. Ian thought to himself, if I hadn't gone to Lloyd Village, his father would have died and he would have been sold into slavery by bandits. Now, Ian can be sure of one thing, the poison he drank in his previous life must have been created by him. Ian thought, he must have followed orders and created that poison even though he knew Ragnar's plan. With every doubt growing in his heart, Ian began to have murderous intent when glancing at Douglas. Should I eliminate him? But then Ian stopped himself. No, such hasty action could be very dangerous. Ian tried to calculate carefully, he has the talent to become the greatest alchemist in history, I can turn him into my side. But, even if he lives differently from before, it can't be said that he won't betray me. Then, Ian hesitantly looked at his hand. He seemed to be wondering whether he should let this hand be stained with blood again. If Ian killed Douglas now, he would be no different from Ragnar, out of suspicion and fear of betrayal, he would kill without mercy. Ian was lost in confused thoughts when Captain Arnold came running, Mr. Wizard. Seeing him panting rapidly, Ian asked, what's going on? Arnold replied while breathing heavily, suddenly he ran away so I chased him. Arnold glanced at the sleeping Douglas and asked curiously, who is that child? Ian immediately explained, I thought he was going to do something reckless so I let him sleep. Ian stood up and asked Arnold, since he was here, please take him back to the village. Seeing that Ian was about to leave somewhere again, Arnold wondered, are you not coming with us? Ian glanced at the captain, hesitated for a moment, then said, I have to go somewhere. After that, Ian slowly walked towards the forest. Perhaps Ian couldn't be as cold-blooded and heartless as Ragnar and instead of killing people, he chose to put his focus on Douglas. Regardless of whether Douglas will betray him or not, at least Ian is not ashamed of his conscience now. That night, at Radio's house, it was late but light was still shining from the windows. Radio after waking up, he immediately sat by the bed and kindly asked his son, Douglas, are you sleeping? Douglas was upset inside, not wanting to face his father but still reluctantly replied, not yet. The radio said, Barton told me, a certain magician came to the village and saved us and I also heard you tried to do something reckless again, rude. Douglas frowned sadly and explained, I was just trying to find a flower. Even though he knew that Douglas had good intentions, because he was worried about his child, Radio still scolded the boy. Maybe there were still bandits near that village. Douglas couldn't control his anger and immediately sat up, so what should I do? That magician said he would be in pain. Radio sighed and comforted his son, Dad is okay if he finds Landio's flowers. Douglas was both heartbroken and upset and burst into tears. It's been a year since I found him. Does that flower even exist? Suddenly at this moment, from outside Radio's door a clear voice rang out, it exists. Radio nervously walked towards the door, who? Ian came back, he stood outside and called in, I heard he was looking for Landio's flowers. The radio heard that and immediately opened the door. He was a bit surprised when the person who came was a boy. Entering the door, Ian immediately pulled down his hat and apologized. Douglas recognized it immediately and told his father, yes, that magician. Radio was surprised, what? Ian placed a block of ice on the table and introduced himself, I'm Ian Pog. The radio asked curiously, what is that? After careful observation, he was stunned, that is, Landio's flower, which is being kept inside a block of transparent ice. Ian told Radio, I'll give you this flower, but let me ask you a question. How did he know about this herb if its effects were still unknown? The Radio hesitantly replied, it was because. The diary, he reluctantly revealed. I found it in a diary. Radio took out the diary and said, this book is the herbal diary that my father left me. Radio flipped through a few pages of the book and showed Ian, if he looked at this page. There are records of Landio's flowers, which neutralize mana, only found in the northern continent. A flower with 12 petals, poisonous green stems and roots, withers as soon as picked, unable to be cultivated or harvested. Ian was surprised and asked Radio if his father also knew how to make medicine. Radio immediately said it was a family business. Ian said again, then this diary must be a family heirloom. Radio thought for a moment and then replied, well, almost like that. Ian asked Radio directly with a stern look, then he must know that, for a magician with a mana heart and a mana brain, Landio's flower has the ability to neutralize mana, which is a deadly poison. Radio heard that and was a bit surprised, not thinking that a boy like Ian would be so knowledgeable about this matter. Radio honestly replied, I understand what you mean, but our family's alchemist would never create medicinal pills to harm others. He even assured me that I could bet on the family name. Hearing this, Ian suddenly looked away from his cold eyes and looked towards Douglas. Douglas was startled and didn't understand why Ian was giving him such a hostile look. After hearing Radio's commitment, Ian was able to relax a bit, I understand. Ian picked up the flower and said, thank you for answering the question. There's more. Ian began to undo the freezing magic so the flower could return to its original form. When the outer layer of ice completely disappears, only the wilted flower branch remains. Ian sadly confessed to Radio, even I couldn't find it, I could only freeze it and preserve its shape. Radio was shocked, you lied to me, Ian immediately explained, I was just trying to prove that you can always find Landio's flowers. Ian suddenly reached out his hand and said, Mr. Radio, how about talking to me? The Radio asked in bewilderment, exchange. Ian immediately said, I will continuously give you mana, so that you don't die from mana poisoning. I also promise to find a way to allow you to use Landio's flowers. Ian thought to himself, I can definitely find information related to it, information that Ragnar and Douglas found. Ian gave Radio a condition, so please come with me to the capital. Radio was surprised, the capital of Asia, why do I have to go there? Ian continued to say, please create a mana elixir for my mana deficiency, and then learn how to make an antidote for my mother's illness. Radio asked suspiciously, you wouldn't expect a famous alchemist, I'm not that good at alchemy. Ian calmly explained, I want someone to stay with me and constantly provide me with medicinal pills. To convince Radio, Ian looked at Douglas again and said that the boy ran into the forest full of bandits to find herbs that could cure his illness. Please make the right decision, at least for him. Radio was constantly surprised, so he was extremely hesitant. He thought to himself, who is he? He is not a normal child. Because there were still so many concerns, Radio asked Ian, can you give me time to think? Ian immediately nodded, as long as he wanted. Looking at Radio father and son happily arguing with each other, Ian thought to himself, in this life, Douglas didn't have to lose his father or become a slave. And his talent will not fall into the hands of Ragnar. The next afternoon, Ian stood quietly from outside the village looking towards Radio's house. He was extremely looking forward to the appearance of father and son. Seeing Ian standing there blankly, Captain Arnold called out, Mr. Wizard. Arnold informed Ian that we were ready to return to the Lord's castle. Ian remained silent without responding. He glanced slightly towards Radio's house. That small house was still closed and quiet. Perhaps Ian couldn't convince Radio. Ian was a little disappointed and said to Arnold, okay, let's go back. Ian passed by Radio's house. He was still wondering. He still hadn't decided yet. Suddenly at this moment, Radio's door made a rattling sound. Radio and his son walked out with a bag. Douglas was surprised when he opened the door to see Ian standing outside waiting for them. Yes, mage. Ian heard Douglas's voice and turned around immediately. Ian approached and asked Radio, have you decided yet? Radio scratched his head and said, well, what choice do I have? I have to live first. Radio smiled and said to John, please keep your promise. Ian happily replied, of course. Ian suddenly glanced at Douglas, how naive and adorable the boy was. Douglas nervously hugged his father and hesitantly asked Ian, can you really cure my father? Ian smiled and looked at the boy, feeling a bit hesitant at this unexpected question. Ian finally nodded, assuring Douglas, okay, I promise. Douglas innocently asked again to make sure, is it true? Ian immediately confirmed that it was true. Douglas immediately smiled brightly, then can you consider me the leader? Ian was a bit surprised, leader, okay, maybe. Douglas excitedly smiled brightly and said, yes, Chief. Ian remembered Douglas from his previous life. Every time I see Ian, he glares at me and chases me away, out of my sight. Compared to the current Douglas, Ian wondered confusedly, was he like that when he was young? Suddenly, a galloping horse ran straight towards where they were standing. Ian curiously turned his head to see what was so urgent. A knight brought urgent news to Ian, Mr. Wizard, we must quickly return to the castle. Ian asked worriedly, did something happen? The knight immediately said, I heard that the prince has crossed the Gamas River. Ian was surprised, Gamas River, has it passed? The knight replied, yes, well, this news was announced this morning. Hearing that, Ian frowned and thought, why are they just announcing it now? There wasn't much time left, so Ian told the knight, please lend me your horse. The knight worriedly asked, do you know how to ride a horse? Ian walked up to the horse and replied, not very good, but he can become my friend. When he finished, he leaned closer and talked to the horse, taming it. The spell immediately took effect, the horse's eyes glowed blue with magic. Ian gently whispered to it, I want to go to the castle, can you take me there? As soon as the horse heard Ian's request for help, it immediately lowered its demonic leg. It obediently lay there while Ian climbed into the saddle. Before leaving, Ian told Arnold, Mr. Arnold, please take Mr. Radio with you. He confidently sat on the horse's back and said, I will go first. Go back in time to 2 days earlier, when the convoy escorting Crown Prince Hayden had just crossed the Gamas River. Inside the carriage at this moment was a heavy and terrifying atmosphere. Crown Prince Hayden looked thoughtfully outside. He was recalling the conversation he had with the king before this trip, please call me, Your Majesty. The king said to Hayden, I have something to tell you before I leave. I heard that Herbert often meets with the 5 princes. The king said thoughtfully and worriedly, because many nobles act according to the ivory tower, so you probably know whose side the tower's owner is on is very important. He judged that it seemed like the tower's owner intended to side with the 5 princes. The king also warned Hayden that, and the 5th Prince Ragnar is a smart child, I am sure he will take advantage of Herbert and try to drag famous people under his wing. The monarch turned to look at Hayden with stern eyes. He ordered Hayden, Ian Phage, do everything you can to make him your man before the ivory tower reaches him. The king further emphasized that I am telling you to make him join your side and build a foundation. Hayden remembered his father's instructions and felt tired. He had a headache thinking, even if he was a magician, how could a child help? The ivory tower was full of magicians, yet none of them were on his side. Hayden thought indignantly, how dare he abandon me, his next of kin, and choose the 5th prince. He told himself, the day I ascend the throne, I will eliminate those bastards. Hayden was frustrated inside when from outside, the captain of the Royal Knights' second team, Oliver Raywood, called out to him, Your Highness. Oliver looked worried and said, I think it's best to notify the Mogrian family. Hayden replied indifferently, I remember we finished discussing it. Oliver is still trying to convince Hayden, we have to give them time to at least prepare before you come, please consider them. Hayden calmly said, that reminds me, isn't your family part of the Mogrian family in the north? Oliver immediately replied, yes, that's right. Hayden continued asking, how long will it take to get there? Oliver estimated, it seems like it will take another 2 days. Hayden smiled cunningly and said, good, 2 days is enough, send them the message. Let's see how the northern defenders or shields of the empire will prepare for the royal family's visit in 2 days. Although Oliver did not agree with Hayden's attitude, there was nothing he could do. He shyly replied, yes, Your Highness. Thus, with Hayden's arrogant personality in love of making things difficult for others, news of the royal escort's journey reached Lord Marcus extremely late. Because of that intentional delay, Lord Marcus's castle is currently in turmoil. Lord Marcus directly instructed the servants, "This is where His Royal Highness the Crown Prince will stay, remember not to miss any dust." The Lord thought tiredly and thought, "I thought they wouldn't come because no one told me," but suddenly they didn't. As soon as he saw the butler, the Lord eagerly asked, "Hogar, have the other families arrived?" The butler hurriedly reported. Then, "Sir, all the families arrived except the Macfardens and the Dreywoods, who announced their arrival soon." The Lord worriedly continued asking, "What about the magician, is there still no news?" The butler immediately replied, "No, not yet." The Lord said, "The situation is too difficult, let's go out for now." Just a moment later, outside Lord Marcus's castle, the announcement rang out, "His Highness the Crown Prince bid." After the sound of communication, all other sounds seemed to be overwhelmed by the steady sound of horse hooves, as the royal escort solemnly entered. Crown Prince Hayden's carriage stopped right in front of the castle. He slowly walked down and leisurely looked around. Seeing that the Crown Prince was about to enter the castle, a noble asked quietly to the Lord, "Dear, where is the magician?" The Lord was worried and didn't know what to do. He stammered and said, "Magician." At that moment the sound of horse hooves came from afar and Ian shouted, "Stop." The horse was galloping like crazy. Hearing the command, it slowly slowed down. Ian lay collapsed on the saddle. His small body had not been able to easily hold on to the horse's back until this moment. Ian looked up listlessly and said to the Lord, "Sorry I was late." The Lord happily helped Ian down. "He has arrived, that's it, please come this way." The other nobles who saw Ian for the first time couldn't help but be surprised. They whispered to each other, "That boy is the rumored magician, that kid can't even ride a horse." The Lord put his arm around Ian's shoulder and said, "The magician has been summoned by royal order, and he must stand in the highest position according to the Empire's laws." As soon as the Lord finished speaking, Ian was already standing opposite Crown Prince Hayden. Hayden coldly asked, "Are you Ian Phage?" Ian just nodded silently. He thought to himself, a face he hadn't seen in a long time. Looking at the three magicians accompanying the Crown Prince, Ian observed attentively. Among those people was a girl he hadn't seen for a long time, the black-haired girl. Cecilia, a spy from the Kogod Empire. Even though he knew Cecilia's identity, when he saw her smiling at him, Ian still had to act innocent and politely smile back. That evening, a grand banquet was held at the castle to welcome Crown Prince Hayden. In the middle of the party, Oliver respectfully told Hayden, "Your Highness, you must not drink too much." Hayden looked dissatisfied and replied that there was nothing else good to drink besides this wine. Hayden whined in annoyance, I can't believe I have to hang out with these obnoxious nobles after traveling such a long way. This party is not fun at all, and I don't like that brat either." Hayden continued to complain to Oliver, "I want to go back to rest early." Meanwhile, magician Cecilia was also holding a glass of wine in her hand, but she wasn't diligently drinking like Hayden, but seemed to be observing and looking for something. Cecilia thought to herself, what a strange coincidence, the Coldwood Empire was also interested in that boy. Not long ago, the Coldwood Empire gave 2 instructions, to eliminate the rumor about Ian by personally observing it. If it's true, then both the magician boy and his mother must be captured and returned to the Empire. Cecilia is curious, what kind of person is he that causes such chaos? I will probably go find him. Outside the training ground at Lord Marcus's castle at this time, the scene was extremely quiet, the bright moonlight shining down and the flickering fire had partly dispelled the darkness. Cecilia searched the castle for Ian and finally found him alone, quietly standing in the middle of the training ground. There he was. Cecilia smiled cunningly, thinking if she should test its rumored ability, let's start with something light. Something equivalent to a blow. Cecilia silently approached Ian, quietly using magic to create countless magic arrows. She didn't even bother to ask Ian but instead launched a series of sharp arrows at him. The arrows flew like rain and simultaneously crashed into the ground, causing smoke and dust to fly up. As soon as the dust cleared, Cecilia widened her eyes in shock. Ian was not injured at all, not even a scratch. Cecilia exclaimed in surprise, "A shield?" Ian turned around and glared and asked, "Who are you?" Cecilia arrogantly replied, looking at my magic without knowing why. "I'm your senior from the ivory tower, I'm just asking." Ian questioned harshly, "Are you asking someone else like that?" Cecilia raised her voice jokingly, "Oh my god, look at this kid talking, seniors can joke around with juniors, you don't have to make me feel bad." Ian heard her voice and his liver boiled. He coldly called her name, Cecilia. Cecilia was a little surprised. Ian continued calling, "Cecilia Coldwalker." When Cecilia heard that, she was shocked and startled. She stammered nervously and asked Ian, Who are you, how do you know that name?" Ian immediately replied, "I know you very well." Ian chuckled inwardly, "I don't know, I wiped out the Coldwalkers creeping around the kingdom in my previous life." Ian smiled smugly and said to Cecilia, "If you want, I can name other people too." Cecilia scared away, "Stop talking nonsense." Ian walked up to Cecilia, and in turn pointed out the names of the other spies, the boy at the Moulton family stable. Royal Secretary Robin, Ariel from the National Guard in Platoon 9, assistant to the palace's head maid. Well, the head maid probably hasn't arrived yet. Ian smirked and asked Cecilia, "Do you know what these people's general expressions are?" "I think I do." Cecilia said, both worried and annoyed, "Kid, I'm not sure how you know these names." Cecilia kept an eye on Ian. As she spoke, she conjured a fireball in her hand. "But it's better for you to pretend you don't know them." As soon as she finished speaking, Cecilia did not hesitate to throw a fireball at Ian, and a terrible explosion occurred. The entire training ground quickly caught fire. But from within that sea of fire, a white smoke suddenly rose. The faint fire from earlier quickly disappeared in Cecilia's stunned eyes. Ian suddenly stood there, performing some kind of magic in his hands. "You bluntly exposed Cecilia, I already knew that you were a Coldwalker." Cecilia worriedly asked, "Then why are you here alone if you already know?" She was still surprised in her heart. Could it really avoid her previous attack? What was it? Ian smiled happily and replied, "I also knew that you would come find me at the training ground," he said as he raised the ball in his hand high. Cecilia looked up curiously, then her eyes widened in panic. Above were dozens of ice cubes pointing their spears straight at Cecilia. Ian said triumphantly to Cecilia, "I already guessed it." Then, Ian coldly pointed his hand at her. Ice. After Ian's instructions, a series of sharp ice rushed forward at the same time. Cecilia stepped back in panic. Luckily for her, she quickly established a mana barrier before her body was punctured. But Cecilia's mana barrier didn't last long. After colliding with some ice, it began to show large cracks. She was horrified and just swore, "Fuck you." Ian summoned a giant fireball above his head again. The power of this fireball was clearly dozens of times superior to Cecilia's fireball. Ian looked at Cecilia with cold eyes, chanting a spell, bursting into flames. Immediately he threw the fireball at Cecilia. She thought in horror, "I can't move with the mana barrier, I'll die." In a precarious situation, Cecilia was forced to remove the mana barrier. As soon as the barrier disappeared, she immediately turned and ran. However, he still couldn't dodge the rushing ice. Cecilia was grazed all over her body, limbs, ribs, and face. Injury is inevitable, but this is better than death. Thanks to her head running, Cecilia was able to avoid the terrible explosion caused by the fireball. She was covered in injuries and turned her head in horror to look at the explosion behind her. Cecilia is still in shock. I'm still alive. She fell to the ground in pain, thinking to herself, that guy, because he used fire, must have run out of mana. She silently calculated that other people would start coming, with no evidence that she was a spy. And they won't be suspicious just because of the child, the tower's magicians will believe me too. Cecilia was still lying there thinking about whether I should recover and deal with it later, while Ian suddenly approached her. Ian stood in front of Cecilia and calmly said, "I plan to make a name for myself, by shooting you." With calculations in mind, Cecilia proudly said, "Do you think it will work?" Ian smiled cunningly and replied, "Of course, there is evidence that you don't even know about." Cecilia started to feel uneasy. "What are you talking about?" At this moment, the royal knights and magicians of the ivory tower arrived. Oliver asked in surprise, "What happened? and the magicians rushed over. Cecilia. They shouted feverishly, "What's wrong with you? These injuries are." Ian firmly admitted that I did it. Everyone's eyes turned to him. Oliver immediately told Ian, "Please explain, what happened?" Ian immediately turned on his acting mode, lying without blinking. "I happened to see it, that woman was talking to someone wearing a mask." Cecilia's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" Ian said with a condescending look, "Then suddenly she tried to kill me." Oliver continued asking, "What if you made her like that?" Ian immediately argued, "Because I needed to live." Oliver carefully asked, "Can you prove it?" Ian immediately replied, "I noticed as if they were checking something. A mark on their body." Oliver heard that and thought for a moment in doubt. After that, he without hesitation ordered and inspected that person's body. The two magicians accompanying Cecilia immediately stood up to protect her. "Hey Captain, don't you think it's too much? Have you forgotten that we are magicians of the Ivory Tower?" Oliver immediately pulled out his check. The two magicians immediately withdrew in fear. Oliver solemnly raised his sword and said, "The person with the highest authority is this, and if this has happened for the reason the boy said. Whether the tower's mages are involved or not, it is our responsibility to find out the truth." The magician immediately regained his previous aggressive attitude and lowered his voice to Oliver, "So at least let me heal her first." Oliver coldly replied, "You can do it after a comprehensive check." He then waved his hand and ordered two female knights to check on Cecilia. Just a moment later, the inspection was completed. Oliver immediately asked the two female knights if there was anything suspicious. The two girls bowed their heads and replied, "We didn't find anything." Those two magicians started screaming again, "What did I say? How could you doubt her? We have to heal her immediately, urgently." Oliver turned around and asked Ian if he was lying. Ian honestly shook his head, "Of course not." Then, Ian confidently walked towards Cecilia, who was startled and scared. Ian came up behind her and said, "Excuse me." Cecilia looked behind uneasily, "What were you doing?" Ian had now placed his hand on the back of Cecilia's neck and performed some magic. Suddenly everyone looked at Cecilia in surprise. A mana seal appeared clearly on the back of her neck. Cecilia was also surprised by this seal. She looked at Ian in horror and asked, "Kid, what did you do?" Ian smiled slightly and said complacently, "I was wondering what you two were doing. It seems they checked for this." Ian recalls what he learned about Coldwood spies from his previous life. Code Walker is sent to a training school with a mark. They don't know about it because only the management knows. Even though I found out only after interrogating a manager for a year. Oliver did not know about Codewalker's secret at this time, so he immediately turned to ask the other two magicians, "Does anyone know what this sign means?" Those two guys stammered and said, This is the first time I've seen this." Oliver asked Ian again, "What about you?" Ian answered in a naive voice, "It was also the first time." He thought proudly, even if no one knew what it meant, it was still proof. After a moment of reflection, Oliver gives the order to heal her, then we will interrogate her. Oliver asked the two magicians, "Please prepare a mana prison." They reluctantly replied, "Yes, yes." After assigning the task, Oliver turned to Ian again. He said, "If it's all true, the Emperor will give you a reward." After that, Oliver immediately reported what happened at the training ground to Hayden. He asked in surprise, "Did that kid defeat the level 3 magician of the Ivory Tower?" Oliver immediately replied, "Yes." Hayden laughed, "Haha, I didn't expect that." Hayden asked Oliver, "What do you think, Captain Oliver, about that kid?" Oliver said, "It seemed like what the sent magician said was true, the way that kid acted and talked was not like a child." Hayden crossed his arms and began to ponder. He told Oliver, I think I should meet that kid and talk before jumping to conclusions." "Captain, bring that kid here." As soon as Ian entered the room, he respectfully bowed. "Could you please call me?" Hayden gets straight to the point, "Yes, from what I've heard. One of the magicians sent by the Ivory Tower is a spy from Coldwood, and I also heard that she is a talented magician. I think his achievements in defeating and capturing are very admirable." Ian humbly replied, "I am being flattered." Hayden said smiling, "And so, I want to reward you, please tell me what you want." Ian pondered. He was trying to find his inner desires by asking what he wanted. Since he was here, he should say nothing. Ian hesitantly said, then, if you allow it. I wanted to see the old ivory tower site on the way to the castle. Hayden was surprised. What is the old ivory tower location? Why do you want to go there? There's nothing to see. Ian pretended to clasp his hands together in confusion and said, I had only heard about it through stories, and had always wanted to come at least once. That action gradually let go of doubts. Visiting a historical place was what he wanted while being able to ask for anything. Perhaps he was still just a child. Hayden easily accepted Ian's request. Good, then I'll take you there. Ian was secretly pleased. I think I'll be able to get it faster than expected. He happily thought to himself, the location of the old ivory tower and the item hidden deep below it, the dragon language scroll. Dragon language plays an important role in magical research, and that book contains the essence of the language. Ian thought a little excitedly, in my previous life, I found it a few years before I died, so I could only understand a very small part. How much can I understand this time? A few days later, the royal escort set out to take Ian and his close relatives to the capital. Inside, the carriage carrying Ian was currently filled with a happy atmosphere. Ian's mother excitedly looked out the window. This was the first time she had gone this far. She turned around and spoke cheerfully to her son, right, Ian? Ian immediately smiled happily at her. Yes, that's right. Ridio said excitedly, once we reach the capital, I will be the tour guide. Lady Phage, aside from the outer fabric, I have been working in the capital as a magician for a long time. Ian's mother immediately smiled brightly. Oh my God, thank you. Ian frowned and thought, look at this name. Suddenly, the sound of horse hooves approaching the car caught Ian's attention. The second Imperial Knight, Vice Captain Paul, announced, Master Ian, we have arrived. This is the old ivory tower site. Paul told Ian, our plan is to stay here for 2 days. And as the Emperor has ordered, you will be free to explore this place during that time. Paul said warmly, please follow me, everyone, I will guide. After that, he led everyone to a small village next to the old ivory tower to rest for the night. The village is truly peaceful in this quiet dark night. When the village chief heard that a member of the royal family and a magician were visiting, he immediately cheerfully came out to welcome them. I can't believe that people choose to visit this village, it's truly a generational honor. Hayden immediately smiled happily and replied, ha ha ha, it's nothing. Ian was a bit surprised to see the crown prince smiling so brightly with the villagers. He thought to himself that perhaps he treated the residents in a benevolent manner. Ian recalled, in his previous life, he always had a dark and hostile expression on his face. Because Ragnar is always by my side. So maybe he only makes such a happy expression around people who aren't nobles or royalty. Ian mused that he could see why the current emperor preferred his eldest son. Suddenly Douglas came looking for, leader, when are you going to the old ivory tower? Ian immediately asked Douglas, why do you ask that? Douglas shyly said, I want to go there too. Ian thought to himself, I need to get to the underground area at dawn. So he replied to Douglas, then tomorrow when you have free time. Douglas was visibly happy. Really, together, Ian is a bit unfamiliar with this lovely image of Douglas. Yes, Douglas happily exclaimed, wow, thank you. While the two boys were talking to each other, Ridio stood far away, observing and telling Ian's mother that Douglas seemed to like Ian. He turned and quietly asked, Lady Phage, there's something I want to ask. Is Ian always this mature? I don't see that kid looking like he's 12 years old at all. Ian's mother smiled at her son and replied, Ian, he's grown up too early, he's very kind and caring, just like his father. Ian's mother confided in Ridio, I knew he wouldn't say it. But he was definitely trying to make up for his father's support and I felt really sorry. Ridio thought to himself, so that kid is similar to his father. He then asked further, so is your husband also a magician? She shook her head, no, Fran is a normal person. She sadly recounted that he, who disappeared before Ian was born, went to work as usual, only his belongings were returned home 5 years later. Her eyes were sad, and now, Ian was thinking about her husband who had been missing for the past 12 years, her words choked up. She sighed and told Ridio, forget it, it's nothing. After that, they followed the arrangement of the escort group to the small houses of the villagers to rest. The next morning, when dawn had just risen, Ian was already at the old ivory tower location. He slowly walked and reflected on the similar scene in his previous life. An endless journey. After the Unification War and away from the Ivory Tower and Empire, Ian wondered if it was simply a coincidence that he entered the Ivory Tower afterward. And now, Ian is once again standing in front of this massive abandoned building. No, I was guided by something. He thought to himself, this place still looks the same. 300 years ago, there was a war between the Ivory Tower mages and the Dragonians, descendants of dragons. Dragonians' army of gargoyles and black magic are powerful enough to destroy the empire. But the emperor and high-ranking magician, Michel Greenriver, led the other high-ranking magicians, take down the Dragonians and make the gargoyles extinct, preserving the peace of the empire. Michel Greenriver, who had led them to victory, refused the position of emperor and instead became the owner of the tower, creating the capital Greenriver Diem. And this place is ruined, abandoned. Ian walked around looking around the old ivory tower. According to memory, it was around here. Coming to a large stone slab, he placed his hand on it and used magic. Suddenly the stone slab opened. Seeing the tunnel, Ian happily exclaimed, "Here it is." He carefully went down below. The surroundings were pitch black. Ian then used magic to create a ball of light. He threw the ball into the air, and the whole secret room was immediately lit up. Suddenly a fierce monster appeared looking towards Ian, but it turned out to be just a statue. Ian looked at the statue and thought to himself, I was really surprised when I first saw the statue there. Suddenly, cracks appeared on the statue and it gradually moved. Breaking the outer layer of stone, the monster roared. Ian immediately got ready to fight. He didn't flinch at all. Remembering his previous life, he was startled just because he never thought it was a gargoyle that had gone extinct 300 years ago hidden here. The monster that had just woken up had disappeared from the stone pool. It flew to attack Ian immediately. Ian immediately turned into a ball of water. He quickly threw the water ball at the monster. The water bridge pushed the monster away. It was knocked back against the wall of the secret room. The wall was cracked, but the monster certainly wouldn't die that easily. Ian was a little worried. In his previous life, it was very simple to kill it. But more effort is needed now. Sure enough, the monster was still alive. It glared at Ian viciously. Then it aggressively rushed forward to attack Ian. Ian immediately sat down, pressed his hands to the ground and chanted a spell. Instantly, a series of ice spikes shot up, piercing the monster's body. But Ian still didn't stop. He reached out and called out to investigate. To ensure that the monster could no longer survive, Ian did not hesitate to use more magic to attack it. He created lightning that hit the monster hard. The monster only had time to scream, then it was completely silent. Ian breathed in, "Phew, done gargoyle." Now it was only a matter of time. Ian looked down at the floor as if waiting for something. On the floor, another door to another secret room appeared. The door opened automatically. There were no stairs or light below. Ian smiled, just like last time. He chanted the spell repeatedly, and the feathers landed. Ian then jumped down gently into the secret room below. He landed as lightly as a feather, not even making a sound. Ian walked straight towards the ancient book. He happily thought, "See you again sooner than I thought." The dragon language scroll. Ian wondered who had hidden it here. A dragon, huh? Or the first magician. Pick up the book, he told himself. Dragon language, a mysterious language I didn't even understand in my previous life, if possible this time. Ian excitedly opened the book, but instead of being happy, he was shocked. Ian flipped the book over and over. What did it look like? He was surprised and wondered what had happened. Then Ian suddenly realized. Maybe, it's because it's already been used. Ian sadly closed the book. He told himself, if in his previous life, he could have read it one more time. Ian was about to complain about something, but he was startled to find that he couldn't say it. Ian worriedly touched his neck. He couldn't make a sound. He looked at the ancient book uneasily. The dragon language is not a vocal sound, it is a magical language that uses mana as its root. So, there's only one explanation. It's impossible to use the disappeared dragon language. Since I can't use time magic without the dragon language, I can't go back to the past. Ian sighed, thinking he could continuously turn back time. He fell into thought again. It might be bad if he didn't know about this. Ian couldn't help but lament in his heart, his second life had just become heavier. After that, Ian left the old ivory tower without reaping anything beneficial. The convoy continued moving towards the capital, and after a few days, they were able to see the green revertium from afar. Before arriving, Paul informed Ian, Mr. Ian, that we would soon arrive at the capital city of Green Revertium. Ian looked out at the bustling scene outside, thinking, finally in the capital. He looked at the prison car carrying Cecilia again and told himself he should be more careful. If Cecilia escapes and contacts another Cold Walker, the Coldwood Empire will begin tracking her. Ian was worried. Cecilia would definitely talk about him, who knew all about Coldwalker's existence. And things will become troublesome in many ways. Ian was deep in thought when outside the carriage there was a sudden movement that interrupted his thoughts. Someone stopped the royal escort. As the owner of the ivory tower and the magicians under him are blocking the convoy's path, Oliver looked warily at the magicians in front of him. He sternly questioned, Tower leader. What right do you have to get in the way? The owner of the ivory tower DM Tin replied, I have received the order. He directly asked for the person in the night squad's hands, which said that all authority to interrogate Cecilia and related matters would belong to the ivory tower. Perhaps he was in a bit of a hurry. Oliver scowled sarcastically, receiving authorization even before the spy arrived. Herbert still leisurely replied, shouldn't things like this be handled as quickly as possible? He patted Oliver's shoulder provocatively, rest, Captain, the ivory tower will be in charge from now on, so don't worry. Oliver was angry but could not go against the king's will. He spoke harshly, handing the guilty person over to the ivory tower leader. Hearing that, Herbert immediately stiffened his face and said, Captain, she is still not a guilty person. Before the truth is revealed, she is still a magician of the ivory tower. Please pay attention to what you say. Oliver clenched his fists in frustration. The knights were always oppressed and looked down upon by the magicians in the ivory tower. The other knights were also dissatisfied and said to each other, we are the ones who came to arrest her, so why do they have such power? Captain, it's not fair. Even if it's an order from the Emperor, I still can't accept it. Ian sat in the car and witnessed everything. He held his chin and thought, I can see what they are trying to do. They weren't trying to protect her, as a magician of the ivory tower, they just didn't want a common knight to interrogate a magician. Now they will lock her up in the deepest prison level of the tower and try to find a way to make this more real. Even if she is a spy from Coldwood, she won't be able to escape. Ian's mother asked worriedly, why is there such a commotion out there? Ian immediately reassured her, it's nothing, don't worry. There's nothing to worry about with Cecilia anymore, but Ian sighed softly, there's one more thing I need to worry about. Paul suddenly called you again, Mr. Ian, the prince wants to go somewhere before we return to the castle. Hayden took Ian to a majestic mansion no less than the Lord's castle. Ian looked up at this place, thinking, this is the mansion I was given by Ragnar when I reached level 5 in my previous life. Hayden kindly asked Ian, do you like it? He told him, this is the villa you were given. Ian bowed politely, my grace was incomparable. Sir, Hayden burst out laughing, ha ha ha, what are you talking about? Ian thought to himself, in my previous life, I was 26 years old when I received this mansion, and in this life, 14 years earlier, it was quite beautiful. Hayden happily said, now your family will be here, you and I go to the castle, we need to meet the Emperor, right? Ian suddenly blushed shyly, he hesitated and wanted to say something. Ian shyly asked, if you allow me, can I take a tour of the villa with my mother? Hayden warmly replied, oh, yes, of course. Ian was so happy to hear that, thank you. After that, Ian immediately took his mother to tour the villa. This flashy and luxurious scene makes everyone overwhelmed. Ian's mother looked around admiringly, oh my god, Ian immediately asked, do you like it? She shyly said, how can you like it? Ian told Mom the good news right away, this is our home from now on. She exclaimed in surprise. This place. Ian happily reaffirmed, yes, looking at his mother, he was still surprised by this huge villa. Ian also felt happy in his heart, when he received this villa in his previous life. Then my mother left. She was still surprised and asked her son over and over again, unable to believe, was this really a place to live, more impressive than the Lord's castle? Ian thought to himself, no matter how great a magician he was, he still couldn't bring his mother back. So now, you want to share all the fun with your mother? Ian told his mother, yes, that means it was used by the royal family. Ian silently made up his mind, but now it's different, everything he wanted to do for his mother and what he wanted to do with her was all possible. Ian eagerly asked, what do you think? In his heart, he was extremely looking forward to the fact that this time, he would be able to see his mother's happy expression, something that he couldn't in his previous life. But Ian's mother's expression was the opposite of what he thought. It was large and beautiful, and very big, but how could it be cleaned? Ian suddenly froze, not expecting his mother to think so differently from his judgment. Ian was somber and didn't know what to say. Mom, she was still bewildered and didn't understand anything. What's wrong, Ian? So now, Ian has another goal. I will make sure that from now on Mom doesn't have to do housework anymore, so she doesn't have to think like this. After that, Ian and the Crown Prince went to Green Reverdium's royal castle to meet the king. Ian straightened his clothes and thought, I'm a little worried. I have never personally met the Emperor even in my previous life. Ian remembers, when he graduated from the academy and saw how the world worked. He was already lying on his deathbed. The Emperor was praised for his intelligence and wisdom. Ian eagerly told himself, I'd love to learn that, if possible. On the way to the king's office, Ian suddenly stopped in front of a window. He told himself, that is the palace of the fifth prince. Ian suddenly thought of Ragnar, what is that guy doing now? Fifth son and concubine. Although he resembles the Emperor the most, he was born without his love. Remembering that traitor, Ian clenched his fist in anger. Ragnar, his old friend and also his greatest enemy. Ian wondered, what should I do when I meet him in this life? While Ian was lost in thought, the guide took him to the door of the king's office. The guide respectfully said, Mr. Ian, please go this way, the Emperor is waiting for you. Ian carefully clasped his hands together in a solemn manner, nervously walking step by step into the room, excited to meet the Emperor. Will the first meeting in this life be as he expected? Waiting for Ian's appearance, in the room at this moment, was the majestic Emperor sitting on the throne, and next to him was also the first Prince Hayden. Ian slowly walked in front of the Emperor. He respectfully knelt down and bowed to him. A lowly person like me dared to meet him. The Emperor immediately spoke to Ian, raising his head. He seriously praised the boy, the northern hero, Ian Phage. He had achieved so much in such a short period of time. Ian politely bowed his head and replied, thank you. The king saw that Ian seemed withdrawn and worried, so he immediately showed his kindness. Say, no need to try too hard, you must have never been taught manners, that's enough now, so stand up. Ian slowly looked up, still trying to maintain proper etiquette, when a similar sentence suddenly rang out in his heart. But the person who said that was not the king. He had never been taught manners, so there was no need to try too hard. Ian thought a little sadly, even when he first met Ragnar, he said that to me. Seeing Ian relax a bit, the king began to ask Han, who has come here from a long way, do you like the villa? I gave you one of my royal houses. While the king was speaking, Hayden glanced at Ian and smiled and waved to him, a very unstandard behavior when standing next to the king. Ian politely replied to the king, it's a very big place that I can't even imagine. Then he glanced at Hayden and felt sorry for him. He thought to himself, what is he doing in front of the Emperor? The Emperor asked again, do you like it or not? Ian happily said, I like it, my mother is also very happy. Then the king suddenly asked Ian as if to probe, oh, is that so? So are you careful, kid? He said suspiciously, about the reason why I sent the heir to bring you here, and gave you a villa as soon as you arrived there. Ian was a bit surprised by the king's attitude. He pondered in his heart, should he be more direct? Ian thought to himself, Ragnar likes to speak frankly without hiding anything, because he resembles the Emperor, so it seems that day was the same. But then he worried and thought differently, no, not yet, until I have everything I want, I'm just a 12-year-old child, I need to behave properly. Ian secretly decided it would be best to act like a child, so he timidly replied to the king, isn't it because I'm more talented than everyone else? Ian acted like an immature child and hesitantly said, from what they said, It seemed like my magic was better, so the king suddenly interrupted Ian, "You're more talented than the others." He seriously asked the boy, did he think so? The atmosphere in the room immediately became heavy and stagnant. Ian looked confused and afraid to answer. Hayden glanced at Ian, who looked confused. He was also a bit worried. Hayden immediately stopped, looked at the king and said, "Dad, what does a child know?" He was trying to defend Ian in front of the king. Perhaps because he was afraid that his childish words would be misunderstood by the king as arrogance. The king glanced at his son. He was a little surprised and thought, "This is the first time I see him protecting someone." The king thought to himself that this would be the best, to help with the inheritance. After a few seconds of thinking, the king gently said to Ian, "Yes. Your talent, I called you here because of your talent." Even the knights and magicians who saw that talent burst out in praise. "I heard that you helped a lot in detecting that spy." The king began to lower his guard towards Ian. He believed he was just a naive child who didn't understand things, so there was no need to make things difficult for Ian anymore. He told him, "For a citizen who has made an achievement, being rewarded is completely worthy. Now, tell me, do you want anything?" Ian shouted happily in his heart, "Finally I have the opportunity, the power of the current emperor. I have thought about it a lot." Ian thought to himself, "I am a child, there is something that is not suitable for adults, a request that only children can do." He looked up at the king with sparkling eyes of curiosity. "I want to see around." The king was surprised and asked Ian, "Are you looking around?" Ian shyly expressed that I wanted to freely tour around the palace, and tell my mother about what I saw. "What kind of place is this palace and how wonderful it is?" I must admit that Ian's acting ability is really talented, expressing like a child curious about everything new in the palace, at the same time a bit timid. Hayden saw that the king was hesitant, so he told Ian to help him. He once said he wanted to visit the old ivory tower and was very curious. All children of this age are like that. I think you should allow it. Hearing that, Ian smiled slightly. Hayden said exactly what he meant. Thanks to Hayden's persuasion, the king no longer hesitated. He said to Ian, "Okay, I will give you the seal. As long as it's here, you can get around by that piece. You can also give it to someone and ask for directions." After instructing Ian, the king asked further, "Is that all you want?" Ian happily replied, "Is there anything more?" The king smiled and was pleased with this not greedy boy. He immediately said, "Ian, then I will reward you myself." The king called out, "Come on, bring it in." Immediately a group of maids lined up and entered the room. The king also had someone bring in a box of gold and said to Ian, "This is a reward for you, kid. And these servants will clean the villa every day. I will send them to the villa so you can be comfortable." Seeing the king reward so many servants, Ian breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed his mother didn't need to worry anymore. He politely bowed his head and said, "Thank you, Emperor." Finally, the meeting with the king ended successfully. As soon as Ian walked out the door, he felt completely relieved. The pressure from the meeting with the king was really heavy. Ian breathed a sigh of relief and thought, he must be different from other people. Instead of attracting me, I feel more suspicious. Ian clutched the seal that he had not easily been given by the king, thinking deeply that it must be for someone. He is the same as Ragnar. Doubt is fundamental to rule and management. Ragnar said so. Ian quickly dismissed as vague thoughts related to Ragnar. He told himself, "Focus on the important things first, I don't have much time." Then he hurriedly left the main hall. Later, Ian found a garden in the palace. This garden is especially carefully guarded, not everyone can enter. As soon as the gatekeeper saw Ian coming, he asked, "Sorcerer, what brings you here?" Ian pretended to be curious and said, Where is the garden?" He excitedly showed the seal to the guard. "Ah, the emperor told me to show you this." The gatekeeper saw this and immediately replied, "Ah yes, please go this way. I will show you." Ian secretly pleased. "I'll act like I'm visiting a famous place and go there." After distracting the guard, Ian went to the mausoleum nearby. He was secretly happy, finally reaching the holy land of the empire. Standing in front of this massive mausoleum, Ian remembered his memories of his previous life. Ragnar told him, "I like it here, Ian. This place they serve the emperor and empress, no one else can enter except the royal family. I'm just a prince, so I can't right now, but one day it will definitely come, right? Ragnar said so with a confident smile. As a result, he did become the next king, but in this life Ian will not let him ascend to the top of glory. Not having much time to think about that Ragnar anymore, Ian quickly sneaked into the Emperor's tomb. He carefully looked around to see how the guards were doing. At this moment, the tomb guard was nodding off while on duty. This was convenient for Ian. Still, he was very careful to use sleeping magic on the guard. Ian told himself, the other guards were always on guard, but here, I could never tell if he would wake up in the middle of it. So that, after dealing with the guards, Ian felt secure and walked around in the tomb. He turned his eyes to look for something. It's near the Emperor's coffin. You try to look in every corner, it has to be around here. Suddenly Ian vaguely saw what he was looking for in a corner of a column hidden in the dark. Shining the light closer to that spot, Ian was happy, he found it. He silently shouted, "Heart jelly mushroom." Without hesitation, Ian immediately transformed into an ice knife and immediately harvested those mushrooms. He happily put the mushrooms in his bag. Great, this will be enough. Suddenly, a voice rang out outside the crypt, "It's so late, where are you going?" Ian was startled and blurted out, "Who is it?" "Don't say. You're worried that the person trying to get in here is Ragnar." Ian immediately disabled the light ball. Before anyone discovered him, he promptly hid in a hidden corner. Outside the crypt door, there are still arguments echoing in, "Why, but, I understand." Ian became increasingly restless as he heard footsteps getting closer and closer. That person had entered the tomb, very close to where Ian was hiding. It wasn't Ragnar, it was a magician who looked confused and said, "Your Highness, even so, this place is a bit." Hearing that guy call His Highness the Princess, Ian was finally able to breathe. He thought to himself, right now there are only 3 descendants, no matter who they are, they can't be Ragnar. At this time, the princess was calmly reassuring the magician. Not many people visit this place, and people rarely pass by, so the sound does not leak out of this room. The princess said excitedly, "Also, as a princess, it is my job to manage this sanctuary and you will check the magic cast on it, we all have our roles to play." Ian glanced outside and saw Harry Green River, the eldest prince's younger sister. The wizard worriedly asked Harry, "Your Highness, why didn't you let the ivory tower know?" The princess immediately objected strongly, "No." She did not hesitate to say frankly, "Don't you already know that the ivory tower is very dangerous?" The princess quickly clasped her hands together as if praying to her ancestors, "I'm sure your ancestors will understand because I'm doing this for your majesty and my brother." Seeing the princess's determined attitude, the magician could only sigh, "I understand, then I will try my best to help you until the last minute." The wizard asked the princess, who had memorized the basic spells I taught her. Harry excitedly interrupted, "Of course." The magician immediately asked very kindly, "So please show me the light first." The princess started making mistakes, "Well, then let the mana flow through like this." From Harry's hand, a small ball of light flew up. Ian witnessed everything and was extremely surprised and thought, "Is the princess using magic?" Harry complained to the other wizard, Why is my penis so small?" The other guy immediately comforted him because he had only recently started practicing magic. Ian remembered that in her previous life, Harry Green River, she lived her whole life as a caged bird, and when Ragnar was crowned emperor, with the first prince being executed, she followed her brother and quietly ended your life. Ian was still surprised, he didn't expect such a woman to be a magician, why would she hide it? In the Green River Empire, hiding your potential as a magician is a crime. The same goes for private magical education outside of ivory towers and academies, and I'm sure that magician knows this too. While Ian was hiding behind thinking, the other 2 were still unaware and talking to each other. The princess said, "Lord Kevin, next time please teach me the attack spell too. For example, like a volcano." Kevin replied confusedly, "Even I can't use that spell." "Your Highness," Harry said with a chuckle, "I was only joking." Suddenly Harry was silent, she seemed to hear movement from Ian. The princess turned around to look warily. Kevin was startled and asked, "What's wrong, Your Highness?" Harry replied, "I thought I heard a sound just now." Kevin went crazy, do you think someone saw us? That would be very bad. He said enthusiastically, "It's over for today," and Harry quickly reassured him and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Kevin. Only royalty can enter here." Later, when the princess and Kevin left, Ian also quietly left the mausoleum. He thought to himself, "Today I discovered many surprising things. Unexpectedly, Harry Greenriver is a magician." Ian ponders why she risked committing a crime by hiding it from the tower. Probably because she's wary of the Ragnar tower. Ian left the grounds as dusk fell. The gatekeeper saw him and happily asked, "Mr. Magician, have you had enough sightseeing?" Ian, "I kept thinking for a moment, although I wasted a lot of time there, but this was more than enough." He happily told the guard, "Yes, I'm satisfied." After that, Ian went straight back to the villa. Radio happened to meet him at the door. "Oh, Mr. Ian, you're back." Ian immediately asked him, "Yes, where is my mother and the others?" Radio replied, "Lady Phage was chatting with the servant sent by the palace, and Douglas was touring around the mansion." Truly a hyperactive child, Douglas was innocently running back and forth throughout the villa. "Whoa, that's so big." Ian suddenly said, "Well, then, Mr. Radio, can I talk to you for a moment?" After that, Ian went with Radio to his private room. As soon as he closed the door, Ian immediately asked Radio, "I want you to make a bottle of secret medicine for me." Radio asked in surprise, "What kind of secret medicine are you talking about?" Ian gave the bag of mushrooms he just picked in the royal tomb to Radio. He told Radio, "This is a jelly mushroom, it is poisonous, it paralyzes the body and causes the heart to stop beating." Radio said shyly, "You told me to make a bottle of secret medicine with such dangerous mushrooms. Poison is possible, but secret medicine is." Ian did not hesitate to reveal, "Have you ever heard of interrogation?" The Radio replied with some surprise, "Me." Ian immediately explained his intention, "I need a secret medicine to help avoid that type of magic, can you do it?" Radio replied, "I will have to do an experiment, is it urgent?" Ian worriedly said, "Urgently, the sooner the better." While Radio was thinking about a solution to refine the secret medicine, someone knocked on the door calling Ian. Outside the door came the servant's voice, "Sir Ian, the ivory tower sent you a letter." Ian quickly opened the door. Already predicting what Ivory Tower wanted to do, Ian calmly opened the letter. In the letter, "Dear Mage Ian Phage, similar to the royal family, the Ivory Tower is also eager to meet you. Therefore, although we should have waited until the official registration day for the academy before we met, teaching a talented mage along with other novice mages wouldn't be difficult, right? Therefore, I would like to propose that we meet in a week's time, and I hope that you will accept the Ivory Tower's request as a mage, to be on the Ivory Tower's list." Ian finished reading the letter and told Radio he had a week. Radio was shocked and exclaimed, "Huh, 1 week?" Ian frowned at Radio, "Was it that difficult?" Radio replied confusedly, of course not, a week, no problem." Radio added gloomily, "It's just that I'll have to spend all my time sleeping." Ian said shyly, "Oh, then I'm sorry to bother you, but I'll be counting on you." Time passed quickly, and suddenly it was the appointment date with Ivory Tower a week later. Ian sat in the carriage to the Ivory Tower, feeling a bit restless and worried. Ian took out a small bottle of medicine from his pocket. An anesthetic made from stone heart mushrooms. Drinking it would make his heart beat steadily for 2 hours. Ian nervously clutched the medicine bottle in his hand. For 2 hours. He nervously looked out the carriage window. It's almost time to reach the Ivory Tower, the tower that he spent his whole life attached to in his previous life. Ian thought sadly, "This is where I gave up everything and left, I'm back." Not long after, the carriage stopped at the tower gate. The coachman said, "Sir Ian, we have arrived at the Ivory Tower." A female magician quickly came out to welcome Ian. "You have arrived, Sir Ian Phage," she said warmly, "welcome to the Ivory Tower." The female magician smiled and told Ian, "Please come this way, I will guide you to the tower master." Ian and the female mage entered the tower. The tower did not seem too luxurious but more ancient. The female magician introduced, "This is the first floor of the tower, the entrance hall." Ian quietly looked up, thinking, then and now. No, in both the present and the future, this place remains the same. The sorceress took Ian near a fenced area inside the entrance hall. She said, "Do you see that golden plate?" Ian immediately replied, yes. The sorceress explained that it helps him move to different floors of the tower. It is a device called a mana ladder. The yellow ones are for high-level magicians, so they can go directly to the top floor. The sorceress said to Ian, "Would you please step on the plate? Senior magicians are waiting for you, in the tower master's room, on the top floor." Ian stood in the middle of the golden plate and said to the female magician, "Then, goodbye." Immediately a magic circle appeared under Ian's feet. A bright yellow light surrounded the disc, it felt like it was penetrating straight along the tower. Standing dimly in the middle of that light, Ian was holding a bottle of Redio's secret medicine. He quickly drank it before the teleportation was complete. Just a few seconds later, Ian was brought to the top of the tower. He calmly waited in front of the tower master's room door. This big door is also the place that opened the turning point in his life in his previous life, when the tower master successfully lured him to his side and served Ragnar. The door slowly opens, this time Ian will change his life in a completely different direction. He slowly walked into the room. Just saw Ian. The tower master said warmly, "Welcome, Ian Phage. Thank you for accepting our invitation to our tower." He extended his hand towards the chair placed in the middle of the room and told Ian not to just stand like that, "Please sit." Around Ian, many high-level magicians were sitting in circles. The tower owner continued, "You must be quite surprised." But there was no need to be afraid, he reassured Ian, because this scene seemed like an interrogation, not a normal new student interview. Ian folded his cloak neatly on the chair, while the tower master continued to explain. "This is just a small requirement that every wizard entering the tower must go through," Ian thought, one could see from the air. "They want to make sure they listen to them." The tower master put up Ian's information board for everyone to see. "I already knew about your talents, but without considering them, you were pretty amazing. Honestly, I'm a bit skeptical, but aren't we mana brothers with a bond stronger than blood?" He easily found a reasonable excuse for this. "If we can eliminate suspicion, then we should do it now." Ian looked scared and asked, "Do you mean you will torture me?" The tower owner smiled cunningly and replied, "Hee, oh my god, how could we do that? There is no place for barbaric acts in this tower." He immediately used interrogation magic and told Ian, "We'll just ask a few questions and you just need to answer them. Now, let's begin." As soon as the tower master finished speaking, all the eyes of the high-ranking magicians were staring at Ian's every move and carefully examining him. Then, the tower master read information about Ian. "Ian Phage, born in 488, zodiac sign is Hong Duong, his father Fran Phage, was a wandering adventurer, and his mother, Vanessa Phage, was a servant. In the castle." The tower owner asked the first question to probe Ian's information, "Was there any false information?" Ian calmly replied, "No, they were all true." A high-ranking magician asked Ian, "I want to know more about your relationship with the alchemist Redio." Ian replied, "My mother was very weak, I needed an alchemist who could provide a steady supply of medicine, and the Lord recommended him to me." Another high-ranking magician continued to ask, "Why did you visit the old ivory tower?" Ian calmly said, "I saw it in books a lot, I always wanted to go to that place." Another person asked again, "Do you remember magician Cecilia?" Ian said, "Of course." He questioned, "You saw her and a masked person chatting and Cecilia was caught trying to kill you, do you swear that this information is true?" Until now she has remained silent. Ian looked scared and replied, "I swear, I thought I was going to die." A female magician asked, "Do you swear that no one taught you magic?" Ian replied, "Yes, never." The woman continued to question, then, "Fireball, summoning spirits as well as ice spirits, how do you know so many moves? I want to hear a reasonable answer, you don't mean to say I should just do it, right?" Ian said honestly, "I was just thinking about them. For example, imagine fire in the palm of your hand." Ian calmly said, "I just have to imagine it, and one day, it becomes reality." A high-ranking mage immediately shouted in frustration, "No way, this is unreasonable." The senior magicians were all stunned and whispered to each other about what Ian said. The tower master stared at Ian suspiciously, even the ivory tower's strongest probe magic was telling him that he was telling the truth. He frowned and thought, was the legendary first magician his reincarnation? Or is the boy a magician of such high rank that even a high-ranking magician's exploration magic won't work? It's unreasonable for that child to have so much mana, what could it be? The tower master was trying to guess when suddenly a red-haired female magician stood up and said, "Ah, that's enough." She shouted impatiently, "Why do you guys keep asking such useless questions? Don't waste any more time, ask the real question." Another mage said, "Helen, calm down, the tower master is still here, but Helen still picked on you, we all came here to ask her, right?" She walked up to Ian and asked in a harsh voice, "What are you?" Helen said angrily, "Using that mouth to tell us, what are you, why don't you say anything but nonsense?" Ian appeared scared in front of Helen but inside he secretly said, "Yes, she is that kind of person. Helen, she was the youngest level 4 mage before I arrived and just like her nickname Fire Lady, she was very fierce." Ian said calmly as if he was deliberately irritating Helen, "Didn't you already know?" Helen scowled, "What?" Ian calmly replied, "There's writing over there." He read back to Helen the personal information that was already there. Ian Phage, born in 488, Hongduong zodiac sign. Ian asked indifferently, "Haven't you read it yet?" His attitude successfully made Helen's blood boil. She burst into anger and asked harshly, "How dare you say that?" The situation is gradually losing control, the tower owner now speaks up, "Enough is enough." He looked carefully at Ian. "Ian Phage, let me ask you the last question. When you took the mana reaction test, I heard there was a small incident. The soldier despised him and his mother. Do you remember that soldier named Jonathan? The next day, the soldier was found dead, and when he was found, it was said that there were traces of mana on him. The tower owner looked at him and asked, "Were you involved in that soldier's death?" Ian bowed his head in contemplation. The tower master was indeed not an empty name. Not too confident in his magic, he always considered the third possibility. Ian thought that in a situation like this, normal people would lose their composure and be afraid because they were suspected of being a murderer. If my heart rate stabilized, I would be even more suspicious. Ian hesitated, since he said this was the last question, should I now remove the effects of the medicine? After a few seconds of contemplation, Ian knew what he had to do. "I will tell you the answer you want to hear." Ian quickly dismissed the effects of the secret medicine and replied, "I don't know anything." At the same time his heart was pounding like a drum. The high-ranking magicians who were using interrogation magic were all startled and they heard Ian's racing heart. They looked at him in surprise and suspicion. Those people all thought, lying. The tower master asked again, "Do you have nothing to do with that?" Ian answered, "Yes," while his heart was still jumping wildly in his chest. The tower master calmly said, "Of course, you can't kill him. Thank you for your honest answer to this difficult question." He revealed to Ian, "Well, when I said there were traces of mana on his body, it was just a fabrication, he slipped off the bridge and died." Ian frowned, it was clear that he deliberately lied to test him. If Ian didn't show concern and his heart rate didn't change abnormally, he would have realized that he was using a trick to bypass interrogation magic. He continued, "I want to end the meeting here and go eat, but I still have work to do, so I hope you understand. As you may know, your talent is never seen before, even in the tower, a mysterious power of unknown information. So we have to be extra careful about your current limits and how far you can go." After a roundabout explanation, he pointed to the glass ball placed in the middle of the room and said, "The device in front of you is called a mana pot. You can see it as an important component that operates most of the tower. Currently there isn't much mana cured inside, so it has this color, but when it contains more mana, it will turn blue." The tower master asked Ian, "Try pouring mana into it." Ian asked again, "Is it all?" He immediately said, "Of course, because we want to see your limits." Ian stood in front of the glass ball and silently calculated that the container could contain the mana of a level 3 mage. Pouring in the amount of mana equivalent to a level 2 mage would be the best decision. Ian pondered, if I show them the amount of mana in their estimates, then I can minimize suspicion and be placed in a death class. But why should we do that? He reflected on his life in his previous life. He was just a level 8 magician, he was not a sorcerer or a famous historical leader. I have always had to read the mood and live a calculating life. I could have given up everything, strength, power, glory, I could have given up everything I had. But magic, I don't understand anything better than magic. No one can stand above me in this field. Follow the flow of emotions. Ian freely showed off all his abilities, to the point that even though the mana pot had already cracked, he still kept pouring mana into it. The vase could not bear the pressure anymore and exploded. The wizard stood up in horror in a cloud of smoke. The smoke rose high and slowly dissipated in the surprised eyes of everyone. Meanwhile, Ian was still standing next to the glass ball and was holding his chest and panting. He gasped for breath because this small body had just poured out all its mana and could not withstand such great pressure from the vase. Even the tower owner was shocked and speechless. This was the first time in their lives that the high-ranking magicians of the Ivory Tower witnessed a child having such an abundant source of mana. Helen hesitated. How is that possible? She picked up the shard at her feet. The mana flask could hold the mana of a level 3 mage. Helen looked at Ian suspiciously and couldn't help but wonder. So that's the kid. Even higher than a level 3 mage. That afternoon, after Ian had completed his requests and left the Ivory Tower, the senior wizards immediately held an emergency meeting. A wizard angrily pounded the table and said, Ian Fa, the rumors about that boy are true. And he's also a level 4 mage, which means he's on par with all of us, except the Tower Master. The magician said angrily. His reaction when asked about Jonathan's death was clearly the reaction of someone who was lying. He asked angrily, what do you think this means? Before Ian Phage becomes a dangerous threat to us, we must chain him up. The same mage made the offer, entered and graduated from the academy, then served 5 years. Don't you think we should cancel those and tame him right away? After hearing the mage's opinion, the Tower Master thought for a moment and said, doing so would be a bit difficult, but he was right. Ian Phage spending time at the academy would only be a waste. Instead, he is a threat to the other students, which we high-ranking magicians already find annoying. How will newbies and young magicians feel? The Tower Master's opinion was nodded in agreement by the high-ranking magicians. The Tower Master continued to explain, whether Ian Fag killed a soldier or prevented death or not, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that although there is nothing wrong with the probe magic, we will never know whether his lies have any effect on us or not. The tower owner calmly offered a solution. Everyone probably knows that our highest priority is the value of this tower. The more powerful mages it has, the higher the tower's status. So why not accept Ian Phage as the 12th level mage, and then officially announce the birth of a level 4 mage? The Tower Master continued to voice his suggestions, but due to his talent and age, I thought it best to have a special high-ranking mage teach him. What do you think? The high-ranking magicians all nodded in agreement with the Tower Master. That's great, I agree, I hope so. The tower owner received high consensus from the magicians and immediately made an official decision. Well, the person in charge of education is Ian Fa. The tower owner was still pondering over choosing the right person, when suddenly a hand rose up and said, I will do it. The next morning, Ian was invited back to the Ivory Tower as a high-ranking magician. He looked up at the tower and thought to himself, he didn't expect to be recognized as a high-ranking magician so quickly. I had already guessed it, but it happened so fast. Seeing Ian standing blankly looking at the tower, the bespectacled female magician walked over to greet him. Sir Ian. Ian happily replied, oh, we meet again. The girl hesitantly said, well, I heard the news, that you are a level 4 magician. Ian looked shy and replied, yes, that's how it happened. The girl exclaimed in admiration, that's amazing, she's a high-class magician at the age of 12. That terrible rumor was true. Ian wondered, what kind of rumor was spreading? The girl happily said, well, you must have heard the news, but I have been assigned to be your support mage for 1 year, please help me. Ian gave a friendly smile and replied, you can talk freely, you are my senior. She was surprised, senior. After that, she immediately started to tell Ian, so, then because I am your predecessor, I will take you to visit the Ivory Tower. First of all, the girl took Ian to the academy and introduced him to the Ivory Tower Magic Academy. He would have been registered there today, but he would have received special training from high-ranking magicians. Ian thought to himself, do they call that special training? Just planning to turn myself into a loyal dog, as expected of Herbert. Suddenly Ian stopped and softly exclaimed AH. Looking at the group of children who were also being guided on the first day of school, Ian thought with some joy, his friends in the academy. He felt nostalgic, he had also stood there. And then the unpleasant memories that followed came rushing back to his mind. They were all assassinated by Coldwood snakes during the First Unification War, so I never thought I would see them again. Ian suddenly smiled. Maybe it will be difficult to become close friends, but I should come and say hello soon. After touring around the ivory tower, the female magician took Ian to his private room and happily said, "This is her private laboratory. I heard that you were going to use it, so I used the cleaning magic to clean it up." Ian was a little surprised and pushed the door open, looking at the familiar room. He silently exclaimed, This was also my room in my previous life." The female magician immediately introduced Ian to the room. When this tower was created 300 years ago, there were 24 high-ranking magicians, but now there are only less than half left, so there are many spare rooms. The tower owner wants you to use this room for personal purposes. After the girl introduced herself, she said goodbye, "So please wait here, I'll go call the magician in charge of you." The door closed. Now Ian was alone in this familiar room. He began to look around, familiar objects. Touching the antique table, he thought to himself, "It's been a while since I last entered this room." Ian thought to himself, "I got this room 7 years earlier than in my previous life. Now I have the powers of a high-level mage. There is one thing I have to do. Create a new power in the ivory tower within 6 years. From now on," Ian secretly calculated. "Around the time Ragnar begins to act under the protection of the tower, I must create it before that. A force that can oppose Ragnar is protected by Herbert. It is difficult to say that power here is based on loyalty to the tower master, fear of overwhelming power and high rank. So if I reach the same level, no, higher than the tower master, then there will come a time when I will take full control of this tower." After thinking about his plans for the future, Ian sighed sadly, silently lamenting. "It's best to act like a polite child until then. Even I can't pass level 5 with this small body." Ian was deep in thought when, with a bang, the door to the room was opened violently by someone. A seemingly arrogant voice rang out, "Hello." Ian turned to look in surprise, then his mood suddenly dropped. He thought sadly, they just had to send her. Helen stood outside the door and said proudly, "Long time no see." She arrogantly looked at Ian and smirked, "The brat." Helen walked into the room and sarcastically said, "Hello, long time no see, you cheeky brat." Ian thought dejectedly, Helen, they should just send her here. Even though he knew Helen's personality and was not satisfied with her appearance, Ian still looked innocently surprised. You were the one who cleaned up the broken vase." With just one stupid childish comment, Ian made Helen feel bitter. She frowned and replied, "It seemed like he was more than rude." Helen walked over and said to Ian, "Okay, you must have heard the news. Proper manners, the history of the tower, the theory of magic, those were the things he would learn at the academy, but the tower master wanted to teach him in the tower." Helen contemptuously told Ian, "What did the tower master say that would make other children lose confidence if a monster like him studied with them?" Helen arrogantly pointed at the bookshelf and said, "But the problem is, she used magic to make the books fly to her." As she took the book, Helen shouted sarcastically, "What's the point of doing that?" As soon as she finished speaking, the pile of books fell to the ground. "Boring things like that aren't my forte," Helen told Ian, "and those old women are much better at teaching than I am." Helen suddenly approached Ian and asked, "Cecilia, you defeated her, right?" She confided, "I had high hopes for Cecilia, she is also quite good in the field of combat magic. If she had continued, she could have followed in my footsteps. Yet she's a spy." But he was able to defeat Cecilia. Helen appeared generous and said, "Well, since I have become your teacher, I will teach you something." She began to explain, "There are different types of magicians, magicians trained for combat, magicians trained to assist others, and magicians spend their lives studying alchemy." Helen said arrogantly, "The others were just scraps." She arrogantly asked Ian, "What kind of person do you think I am?" Ian sighed and replied, "First type." Helen confidently said, "Exactly, I bet no one can beat me in that field." Helen said complacently, "I am different from magicians who only care about the elegance of a high-class magician. I will teach you my way, so follow me." As she spoke, she walked out. Helen added, "Of course you have no right to refuse." Afterwards, she took Ian to the training ground. Helen asked Ian, do you understand now what you have to do here? She raised her voice and challenged Ian, attack me, make me want to teach you. Ian thought to himself, she is no different from her previous life. He remembered his previous life, even then, she made him uncomfortable by challenging him. Ian looked at Helen angrily, like this time I won't let her start it, I'll cut that thought off. At this time, the wizards in the tower who were at the training ground also curiously surrounded Helen and Ian. What are they talking about? What's the challenge? This kid, I mean Ian, wouldn't it be a bit dangerous for him to fight her? Helen said arrogantly, it seems like there are enough viewers, can we start? She arrogantly told Ian, you go first, I'm a teacher so I'll wait for you. Meanwhile, Ian was already unbuttoning his shirt. He coolly put his cloak aside and asked Helen, are you sure? Helen smirked and said, who's worried about whom? Without hesitation, Ian raised his hand and prepared to use magic. He smiled confidently and said, then, I won't be polite. Ian began chanting, a blue light covering his entire body. Helen also started fixing the field using her fire and arrogantly asked, it seems you have seen a lot of things, are you planning to set up a barrier first? Helen smiled proudly and said, no matter what barrier it is, we can break it immediately. Helen had already planned to start the battle with a series of huge fireballs. Is he still bitter because of Ian's anger so he wants to take his life instead of trying to persuade him? Ian calmly looked at her and immediately used ice block magic. Immediately thick layers of ice began to cover his feet, then that layer of ice quickly spread to the whole body. In the blink of an eye, a solid block of ice surrounded Ian, and he stood motionless inside as if he were hibernating. Helen exclaimed in surprise, are you kidding me? She let her guard down and approached the ice block and said, the best thing you can think of is a block of ice. Are you planning to sleep in there until you run out of mana? Hello, can you hear me? Ice block is the strongest defensive spell that protects the user. But when activating the ice block, the user will fall and sleep so they cannot use other spells. That's why Helen subjectively approached Ian like that. She leisurely stood there grumbling, oh God, I don't know what you're thinking, I was such a fool to hope that. Helen was grumbling when she suddenly stopped when she heard strange sounds echoing around. The other magicians were also confused and asked each other, what is that sound? Helen turned around in shock and looked at Ian, it couldn't be. That was impossible. Helen looked at the ice in shock. Helen stared at the ice block, it was still moving inside the ice block. At this moment, Ian suddenly opened his eyes and looked at her. The cold look in her eyes made Helen startled and step back. Unfortunately, she fell into Ian's trap. Helen deserved to find herself surrounded by a bunch of vines. She was shocked by Ian's sudden attack, damn it. Then there were continuous rumbles. Soil, sand, and dust also echoed throughout the training ground. The vines rushed forward one after another to attack Helen. She ran and dodged to lure the vines to gather in one place, while using fire to burn away the clinging vines. However, this move cannot destroy all the vines. She thought angrily, damn it, even if I try to burn them all, they still won't break. If this continues, I will be the one who falls into the dead end. She looked towards Ian and thought to herself. Before that happens, I have to get to the kid in the block of ice. Helen racked her brain, trying to find a way to get it out. But how? During this time she still had time to wonder, how could it be possible? Can you move while using magic inside the block of ice? While Helen was distracted, Ian took the opportunity to control the vine to suddenly rush from behind. She was horrified to realize that she had left too many openings and had no time to react. Then, the whole training ground heard Helen screaming, Kai, and she was wrapped tightly around her neck by the vines. Even if she tried to struggle, she couldn't escape. At this moment, Ian cancelled his defensive ice block and leisurely walked in front of Helen. Helen forced a bitter smile, I guess the rumor that you have the same talent as the first magician is true. In the situation of being completely tied up and unable to resist, Helen could only sadly admit. Okay, I lost, so can you get these dirty vines off me, kid? Ian smirked and replied, no, not yet, ending this quickly would be very disappointing. Helen exclaimed in horror, what? She worriedly asked, what else do you want? I told you I lost. Ian didn't answer but just raised his hand high in the style of a god of thunder. He began to perform some magic that caused his hand to flash with sparkling light. Just now the sky was still clear and cloudy, now a thunderstorm suddenly came from nowhere, the sky turned gray, lightning flashed in the distance. Helen panicked. Wait, kid, Ian, she screamed, this is just a practice match. But Ian still ignored it and collected the thunder in his hand. Helen screamed in despair, Ian, stop there, stop. Ian still looked like that arrogant girl, no matter how much he screamed, he still chanted incantations. Full of thunder, Ian said coldly, pointing at Helen. A bright light immediately split apart and shot down. The beam thundered down from the sky following Ian's call. The magicians in the training ground were surprised and speechless. The vines had burned down. Did Helen go to hell so quickly? Luckily for her, Ian doesn't want to kill people indiscriminately. That beam only hit the ground, but it was enough to scare her to death. Helen gasped, ah. Thinking to herself, I'm alive. Even the sound of Ian's footsteps now was enough to make her startled. As soon as Ian squatted down in front of her, Helen shouted to chase away, avoid, stay away. Ian mocked her, Lady Helen. He leaned closer and asked, can you still do it? Teach me something else. Helen shook her head frantically in fear. Seeing that, Ian smiled smugly. He stood up and casually said, then I'll go first for now. Ian turned around and left, leaving a trembling Helen sitting frozen in the middle of the training ground. He walked leisurely, amidst everyone's surprised eyes. Ian just spoke softly, making the other magicians startled, apologizing for the request. But please stay away, I'm quite tired. The magicians immediately stood aside to make way for him. One afternoon a few days later, everyone in the ivory tower learned about Helen's defeat. On the top floor hallway, tower owner Herbert was walking somewhere. He worriedly turned to ask his assistant how Helen was doing. The assistant bowed her head and replied, she has a small pancreas and has been skipping meals for the past few days. But instead of caring about Helen's health, the tower owner silently cursed in his heart, not expecting that she would cause trouble with a 12-year-old child and ruin his elegance. What a fool. He thought angrily, when I tried to break Ian Phage's pride by letting her teach him, I never thought Helen would be defeated by the boy. Herbert calculated dangerously. From the beginning this was not a matter of whether we could control it or not, it was not a dog we could chain up and control, but a wild wolf. The old tower owner walked forward while thinking in his heart, we will probably need more time than expected to turn it into a useful tool that can be used. Moments later, the tower master reached his room at the highest point of the ivory tower, the door slowly opened. Inside the room, there was a prince leisurely reading a book waiting. You're here. Herbert respectfully bowed, I'm sorry, it seems I'm late. Your Highness, the one waiting for you is Ragnar, the fifth prince. Ragnar calmly closed the book and replied, it's okay. He bluntly stated his request. Before that, can you tell me the details? Ragnar said with a cunning smile, about that magician. Ian Pog. It's clear that Ragnar, just like in its previous life, is trying to find a way to access and take advantage of Ian's natural talent and control the situation in the fight for the throne. But in this life, it was already determined that Ian would never return to the same front line as him again, he was just hoping in vain. The scene changes to Ian's mansion on a beautiful day after he has embarrassed Helen in front of the other magicians. A boy is happily jumping around in the house, this must be Douglas. Douglas, dressed in a luxurious and cheerful uniform, said, your father is ready to go and let's go. Radio also dressed properly and smiled and told his son, let's go out. Before going out, Radio did not forget to give Ian a warning. Ian, I'll bring Douglas to the academy. Uncle Douglas said cheerfully, I'll be back, leader. Radio father and son. As soon as they left, the door closed, and the house suddenly became quiet. Ian glanced after the father and son towards the door, thinking, today is Douglas's first day of school. He was accepted into the Royal Academy of Apothecary in the top spot as soon as he applied, his talent was definitely outstanding. Ian relaxed and leaned back in his chair. He thought to himself, I have a good understanding of the Ivory Tower's one-on-one curriculum, so it will be relatively easy. Ian suddenly closed the book. He breathed a sigh of relief and then leisurely leaned back. That means, I will be free for a while. Seemingly unaccustomed to a free life, Ian stood up and walked towards the window. Since turning back time, I have been racing non-stop. Ian is thinking about the future again. Ragnar hasn't made any clear moves yet, but that doesn't mean we'll sit idle. He seriously looked at his reflection in the glass window. To regain full strength, my body must develop more. After many stressful days. Finally, there is a time of leisure. Ian was also a bit hesitant. Can I just rest like that? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps made Ian stop thinking vaguely. The maid brought in a letter and said respectfully, Sir Ian, a new invitation has arrived from the palace. Ian was surprised. Invitation card? He looked at the card and thought, there's no event, right? Ian was surprised when he saw the card seal. Whose seal is this? Ian was both surprised and curious, raising his eyebrows. The Great Prince? That night, at the palace of the first prince, Ian appeared in a formal suit. Long thought to himself, did he really invite me to a place like this? There is an unwritten rule that states that witches who are not from aristocratic backgrounds cannot be invited to such parties. Ian stood there hesitantly for a moment, unable to help but wonder, what is this guy thinking? But I didn't expect that the party would be organized by the eldest prince himself. Ian remembered the prince he remembered from his previous life, who was very reserved when interacting with other nobles and had never held a social event with any nobles. That attitude of his cost him the opportunity to make his debut in the political world. As a result, the entire nobility turned their backs on him. Unlike the first prince, fifth Prince Ragnar was an outstanding social figure who had gone about forging trustworthy relationships with other nobles. As a result, he stole most of the first prince's political power. Thinking of this, Ian sighed again. He also had to endure that the first prince often ignored the emperor's advice because of his impulsive and lazy personality. He looked up at the brightly lit windows, thinking to himself, I wonder what makes him so proactive. But this is definitely beneficial for me. However, Ian was still somewhat worried and apprehensive, thinking, as for me, I've never been near places like this in my previous life, so I'll just sit quietly in a corner. Ian then went to the palace door and gave the card to the waiter. He bowed his head respectfully and said, Welcome Sir Ian Phage. The palace door opened. It seemed like the aura of a royal party was enough to make people outside feel dazzling. Stepping inside, the space is gorgeously decorated and brightly lit with candles. As soon as Ian walked in, the nobles in formal attire turned their eyes to him. They glanced at Ian as if he were a misfit in this prosperous place full of noble people. Ian shyly glanced around, thinking to himself, sure enough, standing is not comfortable. At that moment, the sound of the media rang out, helping Ian escape from the prying eyes. The Great Prince arrives. All the nobles bowed respectfully to the Great Prince. After the announcement, Hayden slowly walked out into the second-floor hallway. He looks much more noble, mature in this luxurious suit. Hayden stood on the second-floor railing and spoke to the nobles. I would like to thank the valuable guests who came to my party today. As you know, I will be hosting the banquet tonight for His Majesty the Emperor. Hayden slowly said, normally, we have to start the party with a speech, but today, I want to introduce someone to you. Hayden immediately turned to look at Ian, smiling with meaningful eyes. Ian raised his eyebrows and sat awkwardly, thinking of something. What is he planning? Hayden suddenly reached out to Ian and said, tonight's special guest, the youngest level 4 mage in the history of the Ivory Tower. My precious guest from Mogrian, Ian Phage. Hayden's unexpected introduction surprised Ian, stopping him on the spot. After a brief introduction from the first prince, the party continued as usual. Hayden happily ran down, opened his arms to welcome Ian. Welcome Ian. Hayden eagerly said, you probably guessed that I organized this party to introduce you. Ian reluctantly replied, thank you. Hayden still said quietly, you're welcome. Ian frowned and cursed silently, damn, this was a plot to show the nobles that he was on the side of the Great Prince. Ian also quickly guessed, the plan was definitely set by the Emperor, not the Prince. Hayden was still innocently chatting with Ian, we heard about your performance in the Ivory Tower. He gloated and laughed loudly, Ha ha ha, you were classified as a high-class magician as soon as you got there. I can imagine what those arrogant old men's faces were like. Hayden happily told Ian, when I first met you in Mogrian, I wondered why I had to go all the way there for a stunted brat. Ian felt a bit annoyed, remembering at that time, I wasn't very skinny, but he said I was stunted. Hayden excitedly continued, but I didn't expect you to be so wonderful. Hayden seemed sincere and said, although I organized this party for my father, I really think meeting you there was a great choice. Hayden's friendly and radiant smile was completely different from Ragnar's appearance when talking to Ian in his previous life. Hayden suddenly turned to the side and said to Ian, and I also want to introduce you to someone. Hayden pointed at a person coming down from the second floor, this way. As soon as Ian saw that person, his eyes widened in surprise. Hayden introduced Ian, this is my sister, Harry. Harry smiled gently and said to Ian, nice to meet you, Ian, I'm Harry Green River. Beautiful princess in a royal dress, seemed to radiate a brilliant aura. Making Ian a bit overwhelmed, she even briefly mentioned her admiration for Ian. Your name has became quite famous, including in the palace, so even I had heard of Sir Ian. Ian shyly replied, I'd be honored. Harry said cheerfully, unfortunately I can only come to say hello today, but please accept my invitation to have lunch with me, so you can tell me about your achievements in Mogrian. Ian replied shyly, I can only tell you stories about magic and monsters, so I'm afraid you'll get bored. Hearing that, Harry became even more excited. It's okay, I'm not only interested in magic, but also interested in how this world works. So I really want to talk to you. Ian looked at her gentle and lovely face, he probably couldn't bear to refuse the princess. Harry quickly said, I will contact you soon by mail. I hope you will enjoy today's party too. Ian immediately nodded. Thank you for your kindness, princess. Hayden then took Harry to greet and talk with the other nobles. Ian stood there quietly, looking at the princess and seemingly contemplating something. He looked at the princess, smiling happily and being friendly with everyone. Deep in my heart, Princess Harry looks completely different from what I saw in the palace in my previous life. Looking at Hayden, Ian also felt relieved. The first prince seemed nervous, but he did a pretty good job of hosting the party. Don't want to be bothered by nobles. Ian quietly walked towards the balcony door, he thought to himself, then I should leave, before things get complicated. As soon as he opened the balcony door, Ian was a bit surprised to see that there was already someone there. He was curious and went to take a look. Ian asked in surprise, Mr. Oliver. Oliver also replied in surprise, Mr. Ian. Just saw Oliver. Ian immediately praised, Mr. Oliver looks great in this formal outfit. Oliver blushed shyly and replied, this is an order from your highness. He turned to look at Ian. Ian also looked at Oliver, both of them didn't know what to say anymore. Suddenly the atmosphere became unusually shy. Ian turned away confused, thinking to himself, maybe I shouldn't step out on the balcony. Oliver took a long time to say, I've heard the rumors. Ian asked curiously, rumors? Oliver did not hesitate to ask directly, Helen is the senior magician of the Ivory Tower. I heard you defeated that woman. Ian suddenly remembered that the prince had said the same thing earlier. I heard about your performance in the Ivory Tower. Ian forced a smile and replied, is such a rumor spreading outside? I thought most of what happened in the Ivory Tower was kept secret. Oliver was a bit bitter and said, without that much information, what else can a knight do in this era? Hearing that, Ian also fell into deep thought. In this era, currently the Green River's empire has several mages at the pinnacle of the energy spectrum, while knights, who were considerably weaker, were seen as nothing more than decoration or embellishment. Oliver continued, I'm surprised, not only are you the youngest level 4 mage, but you also defeated Helen, the so-called Fire Lady. Oliver added, sometimes, I wonder if you're really as young as you look. When Ian was told that, he was startled. He quickly smiled and replied, you rate me too highly. Oliver suddenly turned to face Ian and said seriously, now no one can doubt that you have the great prince's trust anymore. The prince often avoids communicating with other nobles, but personally organized this party just for you. But because of that, there is something I need to verify. Oliver knelt down in front of Ian, looking respectful and expectant, asking, whose side will you be on? He honestly said, to me, it doesn't matter who you are. Or whether you are still young and can reach that level. What worries me is that the magicians of the Ivory Tower openly aid the fifth prince. So now I ask you, will you side with the Ivory Tower? Ian replied apprehensively, that's a meaningless question. Who could give a decent answer in a situation like this? Oliver still tries to find the answer. As a knight serving the prince, I must hear the answer from you. He suddenly glared at Ian. Are you a friend or an enemy? Ian thought to himself, it was indeed Oliver Raywood, the loyal knight who stood side by side with the great prince until the very end. Then he hesitantly said, I'm not sure yet. Ian thought he might be able to give Mr. Oliver a hint. Then he slowly told him, however. Ian affirmed that I will definitely never side with the fifth prince. When Oliver received this answer, he was even more surprised than the situation. If Ian refuses to serve the first prince. He nervously looked around, afraid someone might hear. Ian assured Oliver, I used magic so only you can hear, so don't worry. Ian smiled and asked, is that an answer yet? Oliver happily replied, for now, that's the perfect answer. Ian didn't hesitate to continue, can I make a request? Ian wondered, what kind of request is a date? Oliver then said, until you give me a definite answer to my question, please be my sparring opponent. I need strength. Ian asked in surprise, sparring partner? Do you want me to teach you how to fight against magicians? Is that sword likely to eventually point towards me? Oliver replied honestly, I can't completely deny that possibility. Ian chuckled teasingly, Mr. Oliver looks a little thick, doesn't he? Then he frankly replied, obviously I will refuse this request, then I won't get anything. Oliver immediately put his hand behind his neck and struggled to undo the clasp of the necklace. He carefully lifted the necklace with both hands, holding it out towards Ian, this necklace. The queen herself gave it to me, on the day I was appointed as the first prince's bodyguard. It is an enchanted necklace that purifies the mind. Ian looked closely at the necklace and was startled when he heard Oliver's introduction. He thought to himself, that's one of the royal treasures that I couldn't find any information about in my previous life, other than the fact that the last person to own it was the queen. Oliver volunteered to exchange with Ian, I will pay for this necklace. I believe it will be more useful to you a magician than a knight like me. Han said shyly, isn't this something personally given to you by the queen? Oliver replied without hesitation, he gave it to me to better serve my master. My request is to fulfill that request, I'm sure he will understand. Ian thought for a moment and then said to Oliver, if you're willing to go that far, then I accept. I'll take this necklace. Seeing that Ian agreed to help him, Oliver was immediately happy. Suddenly, right outside the palace garden, there was a shocking explosion. Ian and Oliver were both startled and looked towards the explosion that had just occurred. Suddenly, another explosion occurred on the side of the palace. Oliver was panicked because the place that had just exploded was an area very close to this place. He nervously stood up. Your Highness. Let's both rush from the balcony. Oliver searched eagerly. Where are you? His Highness H. Aiden immediately shouted. Captain over here. Hayden was standing in front protecting his sister. Looking around in confusion after something like that happened in the palace. Oliver and Ian rushed over to ask the prince and princess if they were okay. Please answer, we're fine. Paul had also arrived at this time. Your Highness, are you okay? Paul asked Oliver worriedly. Captain, are you injured? Oliver immediately said, I'm completely fine. What's the situation outside? Quickly report, a series of unknown explosions are happening inside the palace. We have activated the emergency communication sphere and are mobilizing all forces to find the source of the explosion. This. Ian thought, an emergency communication orb. The palace's emergency communication sphere, a network connected to the Night Command, military barracks, and even the Ivory Tower. It allowed the concentration of all possible mobilized forces to the palace. Ian implicitly guessed that the emergency communication sphere was activated, meaning that all soldiers and magicians would gather at the palace. What if this explosion was aimed at that? Ian was startled when he realized something. Probably. There's not much time left to stand here. Ian immediately set up a mana barrier. Harry looked at him in surprise, not understanding Ian. What are you going to do? Ian turned around and spoke privately to Harry. Princess, do you know how to channel mana into the barrier? Harry was startled and asked again, what? Ian pressed, it's an emergency so I need an answer. Harry whispered confusedly, I learned but. Ian immediately said, then can you maintain it? After handing over the mana barrier to Princess, Ian hastily left. He went to the palace maids and said, I have something to ask. Has a maid named Isabel ever been here? The maid, still frightened by the explosion, tried to think carefully before answering Ian. What, huh? She was assigned to a separate palace, but she said she wanted to come see the party. Ian thought, sure enough. Their real target is Cecilia's car. By concentrating forces on the palace through explosion, they will infiltrate the ivory tower when surveillance is neglected. Ian was worried, thinking, it doesn't matter what happens to Cecilia, but I have to make sure the information she has about me doesn't pass on to the Coldwalker family. Meanwhile, at the lowest level of the ivory tower prison system, a mysterious person could have easily sneaked in here because a large number of prison guard mages had been dispatched to the palace. The person approached Cecilia's car cell and said, long time no see, S.E. Cecilia. I'm surprised you're still alive. Cecilia looked at him suspiciously. Who is that? The other guy immediately took off his hood and replied, it's me, Daniel. He mocked Cecilia, I was very disappointed in her, I thought she was a good spy. Cecilia met her accomplices and immediately shouted, Daniel, get me out of here. He leisurely said, of course, but I have something to check. Cecilia quickly said, I haven't said anything, that brat Ian Fage knew everything from the beginning, from the existence of the Coldwalker family and the people in it. Daniel looked at Cecilia's car suspiciously, is it true? Cecilia touched the back of her head and said bitterly, it also knows about mana sealing that neither you nor I know. Daniel said again, Cecilia is something most Coldwalkers don't know. Your superiors only told us after you were arrested. He coldly asked, Cecilia, do you have anything else to say? Cecilia replied, that's all, we don't have time to spare. Time, right? Let's go out together. Daniel sighed, is that so? Then, he actually opened Cecilia's cell door. When she saw that, she looked cheerful, and hurriedly walked out, without any precautions. Suddenly Daniel coldly called her back, Cecilia. Cecilia frowned and asked, what's going on? But before she could hear the answer, she felt a sharp, cold blade pressed against her neck. A stream of hot blood. Extrusion. Cecilia's eyes were still wide open in shock and resentment. Daniel coldly slit her throat. Cecilia collapsed immediately. He calmly said, when you were imprisoned in the ivory tower, we debated for a long time about what to do. You're a pretty rare level 3 mage, so we considered saving you. And this is the conclusion we came to. Daniel calmly spoke to Cecilia's body lying in a pool of blood. He smiled cunningly and said, then be strong, I mean goodbye. Suddenly a voice rang out from behind, you too. Daniel immediately turned around in fright. He immediately waved his hand and threw the dagger towards him, saying. The knife came flying. Plugged into the wall. Fortunately, the sharp blade only grazed Ian's face, causing Daniel to scream in panic, who are you? Ian glanced down at the ground next to Daniel's feet. He said calmly, so you've eliminated Cecilia, huh? That's good, then I have one less thing to worry about, thanks to you. Suddenly, at Daniel's feet, large blocks of ice emerged, holding his feet tightly. Ian said sharply, what a pity I met you today. He looked at him with cold eyes and swore he would kill you with his own hands. Daniel felt scared and said, wait, wouldn't it be better for you to let me live? While he was still trying to find a way to escape, the ice had already spread to his stomach. Calmly continued, I can finally repay the suffering of my comrades. Daniel panicked and replied, what are you talking about? I have never killed a friend, you resentfully said, of course not, there are 10 more days before that happens. Now that the cold and icy air had touched his face, Ian said coldly, I promised myself that when I came back, I will put everything back in its original position, he said as he touched Daniel who was completely frozen in ice. Immediately all the ice was crushed and collapsed at his feet. Ian coldly looked at another enemy he had just personally destroyed. Ian approached his body, which was lying sprawled on the ground. He put his hand on his neck, revealing the mana seal, and thought to himself, I've confirmed the mana seal on his neck, that's enough. At that moment, outside the prison floor, loud footsteps were heard approaching. Is one of the high-level magicians who is leading a few assistants to check on the situation of the prison room. Upon seeing the chaotic scene with two corpses, the high-ranking magician asked Ian Phage in surprise, what the hell happened? Ian glanced at the back of Daniel's head, indicating to the high-ranking magician that he had just killed an insider. That night temporarily passed peacefully like that, but the next morning, the ivory tower suffered the emperor's wrath. He angrily questioned the tower owner, there are two people missing inside the palace. The king angrily shouted, from a maid to the royal scribe, what is the ivory tower doing while criminals are raging in the palace? Tower master, answer. The king became more and more angry, making the nobles attending the meeting afraid. He repeatedly questioned, didn't you promise to remove all the roots of ulcers in the kingdom, that's why you asked to give all the authority to hunt down spies to the ivory tower. Don't let the ivory tower have a chance to overturn the deal, the king immediately ordered. I can no longer trust the ivory tower, so I will withdraw all relevant authority of the ivory tower. Herbert can only listening silently to the king's instructions. From now on, the tower master must communicate any information obtained from the search so far to the knights and soldiers, do you understand? The tower master hastily replied, I will obey you. King. The king angrily waved his hand and said, you can go, from now on there will be a lot of things to do. The tower master bowed his head in respect and then quietly retreated back. He must be very bitter in his heart, but there is nothing he can do. After finishing dealing with the matter of the ivory tower, the king's secretary immediately ordered magician Ian Phage, go forward and pay respects to his majesty. Ian slowly walked up the red carpet to the king. The king looked at him and said, so we meet again. Special guest from the north. Ian Phage. The king immediately praised, thanks to your ingenuity, this time we were able to protect the empire. Without you, we would have been helpless to lose a large amount of important information to unknown enemies. That will turn the empire and the royal family into a laughing stock for the whole world. The king said solemnly, therefore, I will never forget your achievements in this incident. He had someone bring a suitcase in front of Ian and said, that's why I want to personally show my appreciation. And the reward I want to give you is this. Inside the suitcase was a dark blue cloak like the color of the sea. The king gently introduced to Ian, this cloak is the only item left by Mixel Green Reverse, my ancestor, and the only magician of the royal family. Due to that person's will, I cannot give it to anyone other than a member of the royal family, so I would like to say that I will only lend it to you. And I will lend it to you until your last breath, or until you don't want to keep it anymore. Ian immediately remembered the information he had learned about this cloak, Mixel Green River, the first and last mage of the Green River Empire royal family. He is a hero who saved the empire and rose to the position of Tower Master using his magical powers. His cloak was an item that was difficult to see, even in his previous life. The king saw that Ian was still stunned and had not thanked him, so he said, since this is just a cloak, I don't think you need to change. Do you want to try it on now? Ian did not hesitate to immediately put on his cloak. But his small body doesn't seem to fit this baggy coat very well. Seeing that, the king laughed and said, ha ha ha, a bit too big for you, isn't it? I don't know when it will start. Ian remembered that this was an enchanted cloak, so he came up with an interesting idea and said to the king, then I will make it fit me right away. As soon as Ian finished speaking, the cloak emitted a soft light, then slowly shrank. Just a moment later it fit perfectly to his body. Everyone who witnessed it was amazed, wow. How could he do that? The king was pleased to see Ian praising you. It suits you very well. The blue color also matches your eye color. Ian smiled and bowed his head to receive the king's praise. Then he immediately knelt down and respectfully said, thank you for your grace. After receiving the reward, he left the main hall and prepared to leave. By chance, he met Princess Harry. She took the initiative to approach Ian and apologize, Mr. Ian. Ian respectfully bowed his head, Your Highness the Princess. The princess shyly replied, "Please don't be too polite with me." The confused princess faltered and wanted to say something. Sir Ian. She awkwardly said that actually I have something to tell you, about what happened before. Ian immediately bowed his head. "I was too busy and extremely rude to you. Your Highness, I hope you will forgive me," Harry said frantically. Yeah, that's not it." Ian looked up and smiled, raising his hand to signal to the princess. "Also, what you're worried about won't happen, so please rest assured." Harry heard Ian say that and smiled in response. The thing she was worried about was probably the secret she secretly learned magic outside of the ivory tower. Suddenly, someone approached the two of them. A familiar voice rang out, making Ian stunned. "Nah, what a wonderful achievement indeed. Sir Ian, is Ragnar on the move?" Looking for an excuse to talk to Ian. Known as a diplomatic warrior, Ragnar did not hesitate to say flattering words. "Thanks to you, the safety of both the Empire and the royal family has been preserved." Ragnar put on a fake smile, and as His Majesty told him, "Your achievement in this incident is very great." While Ian was still stunned and did not respond, Ragnar continued to speak. Forgive me for introducing myself late. Perhaps you already know who I am, but I would like to formally introduce myself. My name is Ragnar Green River, the fifth son of His Majesty the Emperor." Now Ian is no longer calm enough to respond to Ragnar, because his mind is flashing through the horrifying memories of that night, along with the harsh words that Ragnar said. "My old friend, please, never forgive me, now. Your eternal enemy is standing right in front of you." He smiled a fake smile, just like the first day he met him in his previous life, that disgusting smile full of intrigue. Ian remained stiff, looking out. He still wasn't mentally prepared to meet him so early. Ragnar still smiled fakely and said to Ian, "Even though I'm late, I want to congratulate you for getting the position of senior magician in the ivory tower." Ragnar continued to monologue, "I want to show my appreciation to you, for protecting the Empire's security from spies in Mogrian territory." As for Ian, he is still in shock, thinking it is too early to meet him. Ragnar moved closer, raised his hand and said, "Today I also want to invite you to lunch, to show my gratitude." Ian saw Ragnar approaching and was startled. Ragnar seemed considerate and smiled and asked, "Are you free to accept my invitation?" Ian clenched his fists, trying to control the anger in his heart, hesitating and speechless. I'm sorry, Ragnar, but I have business today." Harry rushed out to block Ragnar's face. Ragnar, still laughing, said, "Is that so? Then tomorrow." But Ian bowed respectfully, cutting him off. "I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid it won't work, Your Highness." Thanks to Harry's unexpected intervention, Ian regained his composure to deal with Ragnar. Ragnar remained silent, glancing at Harry, perhaps he also implicitly understood. Harry doesn't want him to get close to Ian. Ragnar guessed that Ian was also afraid to contact him because the princess was still here. He then told Ian, I understand, Ragnar." Ragnar bowed respectfully to Ian. "It's a pity, but I'll look forward to next time. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ian. Goodbye then." Seeing him leave, Ian's heart was still pounding. He just wished he couldn't crush that fake face of his right now. Both Ian and Harry looked uncomfortably at Ragnar's back, leisurely walking away. It wasn't until Ragnar was out of sight that Harry breathed a sigh of relief. Princess Lean hesitated and turned around to say, "Yes, Mr. Ian." Harry stammered, I said it without thinking carefully, I'm sorry." Ian smiled and replied, "It's okay." At that time, if Harry hadn't stood up to stop him, Ian would probably have lost control and attacked him. Before leaving the palace, Ian still looked back in the direction Ragnar had just left. He thought to himself, Ragnar, I met him 2 years earlier, and now, he is just a prince who has to hide his true plot. Ian swears to himself, I will stop you at all costs, Ragnar. Before you have a chance to expand your power, so that you cannot advance even a single step, until you despair and have a tragic end, I will be your opponent in this life. Time flies, a beautiful day 5 years later, at the royal palace. In the royal library, the bright morning sunlight shined everywhere. Hayden looks a bit more mature, but his lazy personality hasn't changed. He sat reading a book, but kept complaining. I don't understand what it's saying. Holding the book, turning it sideways and vertically, Hayden said in boredom, can't they write so that everyone can understand? Who writes a book in such a complicated way? Like that. Seeing that the first prince criticized the book in many ways, his teacher spoke up and advised, Your Highness, that book was written by the first Green River King, telling in detail how to become a human being. Good at ruling, explaining the methods of ruling, as the great prince inheriting the throne, you should learn these things every day. Hayden was depressed, looked at the 2 piles of books on the table, and silently lamented, is this all? After that, the 2 piles of books continued to grow, along with the professor's teachings. Moreover, he also had to study history, philosophy, economics, politics, and etiquette. When the stack of books was as high as Hayden's head, the professor stopped and calmly said, Here are all the books you need to read. Seeing the overwhelming amount of books, Hayden whined and said, I don't care anymore. He crowed and cried, Today is not according to feng shui. Professor Hayden's laziness makes him cry. Your Highness, if you don't read it now, your father will scold me. Hayden ignored the professor and turned to ask Paul, the vice captain, today is the last day of the captain's practice match with Mr. Ian, right? It seemed like he had already guessed what Hayden was planning to do. Paul hesitantly replied, yes. Hayden said happily, they're probably fighting. Then he innocently stood up and said to Paul, come on, I haven't seen them practice for a long time. Both the professor and Paul were helpless against this playful, lazy prince. Meanwhile, at the main training ground of the Royal Knights 2 Command, smoke and dust were flying due to the intense practice match between Ian and Oliver. Oliver was breathing deeply and trying to concentrate. Eyes closed, both hands holding the sword tightly, he regulated his breathing evenly, and told myself, until the very end. I swear. Suddenly, Oliver suddenly opened his eyes, he felt another attack from Ian. Dozens of icebergs are rushing down from above. Oliver screamed in panic and ran quickly from that location. He tried to run in a zigzag path to avoid it, but the icy arrows still followed every step. Suddenly Oliver folded again, his feet dragging on the ground. It turned out that he had keenly detected Ian's other attack, so he quickly turned back, just in time as the hard and sharp earth stakes were stabbing straight up. Oliver rushed straight towards Ian, who was standing in the distance, but his steps were constantly blocked by earth stakes. Oliver immediately jumped up from the ground. He quickly jumped in the air, using the sturdy earth stakes as a springboard to launch forward. When he was almost out of the area surrounded by those earth stakes, Oliver slashed his sword hard. He used his blade to slash a pile of earth, clearing the way to jump into the distance ahead. Oliver looked up warily, thinking to himself. Next is. Just as Oliver predicted, a giant fireball was coming towards him. Comparing in size, this fireball is dozens of times larger than Oliver's muscular body. How will he avoid it? Oliver was a bit shocked by the size of the fireball, but he still did not flinch. Oliver raised his sword over his shoulder and shouted in spirit, flower. Then he swung his sword and slashed with such force that it could cut the fireball in half. Gradually dispelling the burning heat of the fireball, Oliver thought to himself, I can reach him. Limit. Of a magician. Located Ian behind the flickering firelight. Oliver immediately jumped up. Passing the fireball's influence, he rushed towards Ian. Oliver showed no mercy and stabbed Ian straight in the heart. The tip of the sword had sunk 20 centimeters deep, but Ian still stood still and did not react. Only then did Oliver realize that something was wrong. There was no way Ian could stand still and let him stab him without dodging like that. Suddenly, a hand touched Oliver's back. Good job. Ian suddenly appeared behind Oliver. He was now a teenager and looked almost as tall as Oliver. Oliver immediately straightened his shoulders, clearly he was very disappointed. Oliver turned back to look at Ian and said sadly, so, I can't even scratch you, Ian. Ian smiled gently at Oliver while taking back the magic he used to distract Oliver earlier. He teased Oliver, talking about scratches while he aimed for his heart. If I got hurt, I would definitely die. At the end of the match, the two shook hands. Oliver also happily returned and said, thank you for helping me over the past few years, Ian shyly replied, it was just a waste of the wire. Oliver bowed his head and expressed, I have received help far beyond its value. Ian smiled, wow, you really have improved significantly compared to 5 years ago, you cut the fire in half with an iron sword. Oliver shyly said, Ian, can I ask you something? Ian replied liberally, of course. Oliver asked directly, how strong are you now? Ian said shyly, it's not as strong as you think. Ian thought, even though in my previous life I only reached level 5 when I was 26 or so, now I'm relatively fast, but I was hoping that I would at least be level 6. But I can't increase the growth of my body and heart mana, so level 5 is my limit. Ian clenched his hands and silently prayed. He hoped his body would develop completely as soon as possible. Suddenly, the eldest prince's excited voice rang out, wow, he is truly the greatest magician in the Empire. Ian and Oliver were both surprised. His Highness, Hayden happily said, I heard today is the last practice match for the two of you. He excitedly invited, okay, let's go have breakfast together. To increase the strength of my right and left arms, I will give you the most wonderful meal. Ian replied shyly, I'm sorry, but today is the day my studies at the Ivory Tower are completed, and my duties as a mage have become stronger, so I must go see the Tower Master immediately. Hayden was a little disappointed and said, ah, I see, then it can't be helped. Then he was happy again, okay, let's go, let's eat together next time. Ian bowed respectfully, I will arrange a time as soon as possible. So, please excuse me. Ian suddenly jumped into the air. He floated as if a pair of wings lifted him up. Ian smiled at Hayden, I'll be back. Then, he disappeared from there in the blink of an eye. Hayden and 2 bodyguards looked up at the sky for a long time. Hayden smiled and exclaimed, the shirt my father gave him had a flight spell. I don't know what else it is, but I feel so jealous. Hayden suddenly turned around and called Oliver. Captain, Oliver immediately replied respectfully, not afraid to give orders. Hayden asked, I see you're evenly matched with Ian, what do you think, can you fight a magician now? Oliver replied honestly, my answer has 2 parts. First, I cannot scratch Ian, the gap between us will continue to grow. However, with the other magicians, Hayden looked at Oliver and smiled with satisfaction. Oliver also smiled confidently and satisfied with himself. He affirmed that if he was certain, I could deal with it. Meanwhile, in the Ivory Tower, the door to the Tower Master's room slowly opened. As soon as Ian walked in, he excitedly told him, oh, you're here. The tower owner smiled and said, it feels so strange, it seems like just yesterday I heard news about a special boy in the north. Yet that boy has become a man. The Tower Master joked with Ian, maybe that means I'm getting old. Ian politely replied, you will be fine for at least a few more centuries. The tower owner read the records of Ian's learning process, wonderful, I have nothing to say but praise. You are truly a great blessing to the Empire and the Ivory Tower, I'm sure all the young magicians want to meet you. The Tower Master teased Ian, isn't he the role model for every magician to follow? Ian humbly replied, you think too highly of me. The tower owner immediately said, well, we'll soon know whether we've said too much or not. As you know, today is the last day, if you were a normal student of the academy, you would be sent to the surrounding areas, but you are a special case. The tower owner laughed and joked. The last day he only spent chatting with this old man, did you feel depressed because of that? Ian politely replied, not at all, it would be my pleasure. He told Ian, thank you, even though those were probably empty words. Then, the Tower Master took out a card and gave it to Ian, congratulating him on becoming an official magician. This is a symbol of your status, it will help you mobilize the soldiers and people of the Empire as you wish, you will have many opportunities to use it. As soon as the Tower Master finished speaking, Ian asked, are there many places that require high-level magicians? The Tower Master crossed his arms and shook his head, it wasn't just a matter of requirements, there were currently very few high-level mages. Since Helen's gone missing, what else do you expect? I don't want to add to your burden, but your help is really needed. Ian said a little worriedly, so there are many things waiting for me. The tower owner immediately told Ian that you are the strongest and most important force of the Ivory Tower, so you will soon be bound with many responsibilities. But since this is the first time, I'll let you choose. The tower owner posted a series of requests from the sending locations and let Ian freely choose the location. Ian raised his head and attentively read each note. Rothme, the city with the largest seaport in the empire. Benson, the empire's largest iron-producing city. Ian looked at the third one, thinking to himself, and there it was. Freeze. The land in the northeast, the place I was assigned in my previous life. Ian silently recalled that the previous magician had died in an accident, so I was sent to replace him. After that, Ian immediately told the tower master that I had a crush on Freeze. The tower owner nodded, that's where help is most needed. He explained the situation to Ian. We had dispatched 2 level 3 mages and a few soldiers from the army, but it was still not enough. The monsters from the Great Plains seemed to be causing trouble. The tower owner gave Ian a copy of the papers and said, the details are written in here, read it. Do you think you can answer them today? If you refuse, we'll have to find you. Ian replied without hesitation, no, I'll be there. To Freeze. That afternoon, Ian returned home and announced his upcoming trip to Freeze. Upon hearing this, Douglas was surprised and exclaimed, are you going to Freeze on your first trip? Douglas said briskly. That place is famous for being full of monsters, but Douglas has that small mouth. Was immediately stopped by Ian's sharp eyes and the knife in his hand. Seeing that Douglas was quiet, Ian slowly put down the knife. He just didn't want his mother to hear and worry him more. Sure enough, she immediately asked worriedly, Ian, isn't that a dangerous place? Ian quickly reassured his mother, no, it's not that dangerous, it's only temporary, so I'll come back after a few months. Vanessa said sadly, I understand, you just said you would leave next week, right? This large mansion will be very empty. Ian tried to comfort his mother, he would finish the work as soon as possible and return. Dear mother. Douglas excitedly said to Ian, leader, can you check the medicine I made in the lab before you go? I created some pretty good things, so they can help you on your quest. The radio suddenly said, Douglas, you're an adult, shouldn't you change the way you call Ian? Douglas looked at his father in bewilderment. What was wrong with calling him leader? Douglas reluctantly looked at Ian and thought, that's it. Ian raised the glass of water to his mouth, slowly sipping his lips while waiting to see what other strange ideas Douglas would come up with. Douglas suddenly exclaimed, what about brother? As soon as Ian heard it, he was so surprised that he spat water out. After listening to the radio, I was surprised and froze. Both Ian and Vanessa were also surprised and stunned. Seeing that no one objected, Douglas smiled complacently. Then he smiled brightly and called out, Big brother Ian. Ian thought in horror, are you really the Douglas I knew in my previous life? Ian's mother also excitedly said, it's great that he has another cute younger brother. You have another son, Ian silently groaned, Mom. Mr. Radio is even more overreacting, you phage, what do you mean? Ian frowned and looked at him, thinking, why should he blush? Radio shyly told Douglas, you must call him Mr. Ian. Douglas immediately countered, oh, we are family now. You sound so distant, Radio scolded Douglas, where did you get help and you're still so picky? Douglas pouted and replied, what do you mean, my genius is very beneficial to the family. Radio was so unreasonable that he said, genius, whatever. Douglas proudly said, you are a genius. Mrs. Vanessa saw the father and son arguing with each other and giggled. Ian quietly looked at his mother who seemed very happy with her current life. He suddenly smiled along with her. Living in this warm space full of laughter, Ian thought to himself that this was not bad. Later, Ian seriously asked Douglas, you can't call me brother. Douglas was sad but could not oppose Ian, he sadly accepted. The morning of a week later, seeing Ian preparing to get on the carriage, Radio immediately ran to ask, are you ready? Radio was interested in asking about Ian's schedule, were you planning to go straight to Firik? Ian immediately explained, first I had to say goodbye to the owner of the ivory tower, then make plans to go there. Ian did not forget to remind Radio, the mana trap I placed in the mansion. Radio immediately smiled and replied, ha ha ha, you explained it yesterday. He assured Ian, don't worry, I will use my life to protect Miss Fague. Ian still nervously said, I hope you don't have to use it. At that moment, Douglas happily ran up to call, "Brother." Ian immediately looked like he wanted to eat his life, causing Douglas to quickly correct his words, "I mean, leader." Douglas gave Ian a small potion and said, "Please accept this. Selling the medicine my father created, I tried making it myself." Douglas said while glancing at Radio, "Probably. The teacher is not safe," so he leaned close to Ian's ear and whispered, "Probably better than Dad's." Ian smiled and said, "Yes, thank you." Even though he had whispered very quietly, Douglas's words from earlier were still heard by Radio. He patted the cunning boy's head and said, "It won't be long, kid." Ian looked at the potion that Douglas gave him and thought that Douglas still had 3 years before graduating from the Royal Pharmacy. But he was promised a position as a royal alchemist thanks to his ability. It would definitely work out well. Douglas innocently asked Ian, the leader, would he fly to Firik in a cloak? Ian immediately said, "No, I will take a carriage outside the capital. I don't want to attract too much attention." Mrs. Vanessa then frantically ran to call Ian. She gave Ian a large package and told him, "Eat this on the way. I packed a lot. The first box is the food the child needs for today, the other boxes have dried beef and dried fruit to eat later." Vanessa looked at Ian affectionately. "Mom also baked the red bean cake you like." Ian immediately replied, "Thank you Mom, I will eat a lot." Vanessa hugged her son and told her to be careful, don't get hurt, don't skip meals. At first, Ian was a bit surprised. But then he quickly enjoyed the happiness of receiving such attention from his mother. On his first business trip home, a feeling that he did not have in his previous life, Ian gently patted his mother and gently replied, "Yes." Ian happily told his mother, "I'll be back soon, so don't worry too much. So here I go." After Ian said goodbye to everyone, the carriage quickly departed. The whole family was still watching as the car carrying Ian left. They were all scared and didn't want to go back into the house. Ian sitting in the car was also restless and worried, thinking about his family in his absence. He told himself, I have to believe that my mother will still be safe even if I'm not there. A palace-protected mansion, low crime rate in the city, and the secret that only mother has. Radio and Douglas can activate, trapping mana. With that, I can eliminate most of the dangers. Ian clenched his fists, trying to calm himself down and put his trust in his careful preparations. Calming down, Ian looked toward the distant northeast and thought to himself, Firik territory. It's been 25 years. The horse carriage kept running along with Ian's endless thoughts about that distant land. Meanwhile, in Firik, the situation is extremely chaotic. Groups of goblins rushed in one after another to attack the barracks guarding the border. The army commander ordered them to behead them 100 times and then bring them back here to me. He tried to increase the morale of the entire army. Until then, don't give up. Unexpectedly, there is urgent news sent, sir. The commander eagerly asked, what's going on? The soldier hurriedly ran to report, the supply force was behind. Our rear supply force has been attacked by demons climbing over the mountain. The commander bluntly said, what? He worriedly thought, damn it, how could they overrun the back line? The commander immediately changed the battle formation. Teams 2 and 3 remained in place with the magicians, Team 1 followed me, the soldiers all responded in unison, clear. He raises his sword to lead the first team, we will deal with the lovers behind. After that, the commander and a group of soldiers rushed on horseback to protect the rear line. He raced to the rear, thinking fervently, their unit intelligence was very low but they moved like an army. He worriedly thought to himself, well-trained soldiers could deal with them, but they were more than capable of eliminating the supply team that had no combat experience. The uneasy commander could only pray that he would not be late. Suddenly, snow began to fall on the road. The commander paused and looked suspiciously at the sky, the snow. He opened his eyes wide in surprise, there was no snow in the north. But now the whole sky is completely white. What is even more surprising is that the ravine was stopped by giant icicles. From the commander to the soldiers in the army, everyone stood dumbfounded in front of the towering ice wall. Inside the blocks of ice are fierce goblins locked rigidly. They all seem to be frightened before freezing, simultaneously raising their heads to look at something in the sky. The commander was still confused and looked up in the direction of the goblins' eyes. What's going on? At the top of the ice wall, a figure was walking that way. But in just a blink of an eye, the figure disappeared from everyone's sight. Beneath the ground are the scars of goblins stabbed to death by ice. And the accomplices of the dead ones were also neutralized in giant blocks of ice. All of this must have been Ian's fault, no one else could have done it. The ice wall blocked the only entrance in the middle of the rock crevice that the goblins had used to attack. Ian gently flew from the top of the ice mountain and landed on the ground. The commander still didn't know if Ian was an enemy or a friend, so he immediately shouted a threat, "Reveal yourself, reveal yourself." Ian calmly replied, "I heard you guys need help." The commander's eyes widened in surprise at the sudden and timely appearance of this savior. Only now did Ian take off his hood and introduce himself. "My name is Ian Phage, a high-level magician from the Ivory Tower." The commander muttered, "Ian Phage," and he seemed to recognize him suspiciously. After a few seconds of thinking, he exclaimed in surprise. "He is a noble from the northern Mogrian. Is that Mr. Ian Phage?" Ian nodded slightly. The commander happily said, I didn't expect such a young man to come to help us. I heard about your achievements in slaying the goblin army in the Mogrian Mountains when you were very young." The commander extended his hand to Ian, pleased to meet him. Ian shook hands with him and replied happily. "I am also honored to meet General Tsonlian Firik, the greatest warrior in the East." The commander kindly said, "You must be very tired after your long journey." He nervously suggested, "But can you spare a moment? We have a lot of things to discuss." The two of them looked towards Ice Mountain with concern about the goblins who had not stopped trying to attack. After that, the two of them returned to the citadel to guard this land. Tsonlian worriedly said, "I didn't know they would appear in such large numbers." He seemed confused. "No, I guessed it. But not to that extent, they seem quite determined lately." Tsonlian tried to guess the reason why the goblins attacked so massively. "It seemed like there was some trouble in the Great Plains, otherwise." Tsonlian respectfully said to Ian, "You know. Sir Ian, we have sent a request to the palace and Ivory Tower. The first is to request supplies and aid to continue fighting. The second is a request sent to a high-level magician. A magician skilled enough to overcome our current situation." Although he respected Ian very much, Tsonlian did not hesitate to speak frankly about his concerns. "I am extremely amazed at your ability to destroy an army of monsters in an instant, as well as quickly erecting an ice wall. The canyon has been barricaded so we will have more time. However, that is only a temporary solution. We are about to have a war with monsters on the Great Plains. Because the monsters have been continuously invading for many years, the army is gradually tired and our food is almost exhausted." Tsonlian said anxiously, "If only reinforcements and food came, we could continue fighting the monsters, but it seems the Empire has just postponed that request." Tsonlian suddenly turned a steady gaze straight at Ian, and it seemed like he had come to replace the reinforcements, so I suggested we think of a more permanent solution to this problem. After Ian listened to the whole situation and Tsonlian's concerns, he calmly said, "I understand." Ian told Tsonlian that the ice wall could last up to 10 days. "If we monitor the movements of the monsters invading from the mountains, maybe we will be temporarily safe. During these 10 days, we can reach the Great Plains." When Tsonlian heard Ian say that, he couldn't help but feel worried. "Sir Ian, are you going on your own?" Ian calmly replied, "We have to find the cause of this, and perhaps a solution to completely solve it." Tsonlian smiled shyly and said, "Ha, I'm very happy because you seem extremely confident. But I have sent countless armies to the Great Plains in the past few months, and have not brought any results." Tsonlian recounted, "The only thing we discovered was that monsters of different species had stopped attacking each other, just like that they had joined forces, and only attacks humans." Tsonlian pointed to the top and said, "The monsters not only attacked the Green River Empire, but also attacked the northern border of the Great Plains, the Coldwood Empire, the Ron Principality on the western border. They invaded those borders at the same time. Some countries have fewer roads leading to them, so they suffer fewer losses. Among them is the Great Serpent Canyon, leading to monsters focusing on attacking the Firik estate." Tsonlian also expressed his doubts, "But the strange thing here is, On the southern border of the Great Plains, the aboriginal tribes were not invaded by monsters. Sonlian pointed to the first map and expressed his concerns to Ian, as if there was something preventing them from accessing this area. We suspected that that thing was related to the trouble in the southern Great Plains, but we were unable to break through the attack of the monsters in the canyon, so we could send an army to the southern aboriginal tribe to investigate. Investigate more thoroughly. Ian looked at the first map and pondered, trouble on the Great Plains, this is something I didn't know about in my previous life. He squinted his eyes and thought, there were many attacks coming from Dibin Plain, but this was the first on a large scale. After thinking for a while, Ian decided we should go to the southern border to see the aboriginal tribe. Sonlian also agreed. Yes, if you are the leader of an aboriginal tribe, the king of sacrificial magicians, I'm sure he will know something about this matter. Sonlian worriedly asked Ian, do you think we can meet and talk to him? Ian smiled confidently and replied, of course. That night, Ian stayed at the citadel to rest, and the night scene here had enchanting flashes of light. Ian stood on the city wall looking at the night sky. Ian thought, the Great Plain. Thinking back, maybe that thing is still there. The artifact was passed down to the king of magicians, the leader of the aboriginal tribe, the scepter of the Great Plains. Ian feels a bit nostalgic for the staff from his previous life. I quite like that staff. Staff made from birch wood are also rare. He began to recall the world's history in his previous life. 3 years from now, the Green River Empire, the Coldwood Empire, the Rhone Principality, these 3 countries will form an alliance to fight against monsters. Animals in the Great Plains to completely destroy them. Most monsters will be exterminated in the Great Plains, and the 3 countries will divide the Great Plains filled with natural resources. During that period, the Shaman King disappeared and the Great Plains aboriginal tribes were turned into slaves. Thinking of this, Ian suddenly felt uneasy, something that did not happen in his previous life had happened. Maybe this change is because I came back. Ian looked towards the Great Plains, his heart couldn't help but wonder, there was a problem on the Great Plains that he didn't know about. The next morning, before going alone deep into the Great Plain, Ian reminded Sonlian, in 10 days, the ice will melt and break, by then we will definitely find the cause and solution for this situation. But in case I don't come back within 10 days, Sonlian immediately dismissed that unfortunate thought and said, I believe you will return in 10 days. Good luck, Sir Ian. After that, Ian entered the Great Plains. The landscape here was wild and somewhat barren. Only monsters and aboriginal tribes live here, perhaps that's why it's so deserted. After some time flying straight in the direction of the map, Ian landed on a hilltop with a panoramic view of the surrounding scenery. He looked down and thought, this is the neighborhood that borders the aboriginal lands. Ian frowned worriedly, strangely quiet. He thought to himself, compared to the 7 monsters in the north, I haven't seen a single monster since going south. I wonder if this place is the cause of the change that Mr. Feerick mentioned. After carefully observing this area, Ian immediately headed to the aboriginal group's territory. Immediately, the natives guarding the territory discovered the stranger's appearance. They stood up, on high alert, and asked Ian, who are you? Ian stopped and raised his hands to express that he had no bad intentions. He was not an enemy, he was a magician from the Green River Empire. The native cried out in surprise, how do you know our language? Ian immediately said, I don't have time to explain, I came to see the Magician King. The natives immediately became more angry, what did you just say? Ian completely understood why these natives reacted uneasily to his request. Shaman King. Revered as the Tower Masters of the Aboriginal tribes, the Aborigines are also people born with mana hearts and mana brains. The way they control mana is quite basic. But they were raised to be sacrificial magicians instead of regular magicians. Among them, the Shaman King is their king, standing at the highest position. Ian still patiently explained to the natives, I came to talk about the problem that the monsters in the north were causing. The Sorcerer King must have known about it, so please, Ian was talking when a native pointed a spear at his throat to silence him. That indigenous man shouted harshly, why did the Imperial dog dare to cry so loudly? Do you think the Sorcerer King will meet someone like you? The natives all rushed forward to chase Ian away, go away, and say nonsense that we would offer him as a sacrifice to the spirits of that great plain. Ian started to angrily say, I look like someone who would go to hell just because you guys told me to. He opened his cold eyes and looked at the group of natives who were aggressively pointing spears at him. An angry native held a spear and stabbed him. He shouted. It seemed he had to die before realizing his situation. The native did not hesitate and stabbed the spear straight at Ian. Ian did not flinch, he transformed into an ice sword, preparing to duel with this native. Ian also has quite a bit of close combat experience thanks to his sparring sessions with Oliver. He decisively raised his sword, slashed across the head of the native's spear. That spear is made of ordinary wood. Of course it cannot compete with the sharp, sturdy sword created by magic. Ian warned that guy, a human head would fly next. He said seriously, don't cause trouble here anymore, take me to the Wizard King. At this moment, a loud voice rang out, what business does a person from the Empire have here? Ian was alert and immediately turned his head to see who was speaking. As soon as I saw the old man holding the scepter, he recognized immediately, Ian thought, that staff. He asked him directly, are you the Sorcerer King? The old man calmly replied, yes, that's what I was called. Ian respectfully said, you came all the way here, which surprised me. Not wanting to waste any more time, he immediately expressed his concerns about the problem in Dai Bin Plain. The monsters of the Great Plains are invading the borders of 3 countries. However, when I moved south, I didn't see any monsters. Do you know why monsters only invade the north? The Sorcerer King calmly replied, it was normal for monsters to invade the border, we didn't know why this happened. Ian silently used interrogation magic and was not afraid to expose the Sorcerer King on the spot, lying. When the Sorcerer King was told, he stopped, a worried look on his face. Ian bluntly stated, your lies won't work on me. He asked the Sorcerer King, please tell the truth, what is going on? A few rough natives shouted aggressively, how dare that bastard act so arrogant in front of him? The Sorcerer King promptly stopped them to prevent further chaos. The Sorcerer King slowly told Ian, I heard that the Empire's mages had come up with a lie detection spell, but seeing it with my own eyes was still quite surprising. He immediately admitted, yes, lying to you is useless, I will tell you the truth. The Sorcerer King began to narrate, many years ago, there was a prophecy. The originally beautiful Great Plain will turn into a sea of fire, and golden light will dye the land red. Our people who have lived on this land for thousands of years will be cut off and turned into slaves. Ian heard those prophecies and felt extremely surprised, because that was exactly what happened in his previous life. The Sorcerer King thoughtfully said, we cannot do anything, we know that our tribe will be destroyed if war breaks out. Still, we can't sit there waiting and praying that the prediction won't come true. One day, he said, a lady found us. That lady enchanted this staff, shared her power with us, and then disappeared. Ian thought suspiciously, a lady, this was a character he didn't know about in his previous life. The Sorcerer King suddenly changed his tone and said, she also warned that if another outsider comes here, we can't let him leave this place alive. The Sorcerer King spoke as he tapped his staff on the ground, instantly summoning countless undead to rise from the ground. He said harshly to Ian, I'm sorry, but you must die here. Ian quietly observed the magic from that staff, thinking to himself, I see, it's a dark magic. Ian thought about it, he thought it stopped existing 300 years ago when it was banned. But I didn't expect the future to be so lopsided. Ian looked at the zombies and smirked, they were taking him lightly. He smiled confidently and said to the Sorcerer King, I'm sorry, but I don't intend to die without a fight. He boldly declared, even if I have to use force, I will still take that staff that has been imbued with black magic. The Sorcerer King is also old-fashioned, so he did not hesitate at all from Ian's challenge. If you think you can do it, just try it. Ian began to raise his hand to use his magic and told the Sorcerer King, there's no way to take back what you just said. Ian turned a cold gaze towards the Sorcerer King. Whether or not he will continue to win this war easily is unknown for the time being. But with that confident demeanor, you can rest assured that Ian estimated that the power of the black magic inside that staff was something he could control.